Hey there, horror enthusiasts. Today, we're going to dive into the world of camping horror, where the chills and thrills are in full swing. So, if you're a fan of the spine-tingling, the pulse-pounding, and the downright scary, then camping horror is definitely your cup of tea. Thanks for joining us today, and don't forget to follow and subscribe for more thrilling content. Stay spooky, my friends. Okay, so this weekend was supposed to be epic. Me and my buddies, Mark, Ben, and Chris, we've been planning this camping trip for ages. We were heading up to Black Ridge Forest, this place notorious for, like, zero cell service and miles of nothing but trees. Perfect escape from the city, right? We piled into Mark's beat-up Jeep, crammed with tents, sleeping bags, enough junk food to last a week, and honestly, way too much beer. The drive was the usual: bad music, stupid jokes, and arguing over the best route. But the closer we got to Black Ridge, the more the excitement built. The air got cooler, the trees got thicker, and you could practically feel the stress melting away. But then, the weather took a turn. The sky went from this bright blue to this weird, sickly gray. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves like crazy. And just as we were pulling into this dusty old campground, the first drops of rain started to fall. Dude, seriously? Ben groaned, looking up at the sky. Rain? On the first day? Relax, Benny boy, Mark laughed. A little rain never hurt anyone. Besides, we've got a tarp, remember? Yeah, famous last words, right? As we were setting up camp, this old pickup truck rolled in. It was beat up, covered in mud, and looked like it belonged in a junkyard. This dude with these crazy, intense eyes got out. He gave us this weird smile, like not friendly, more like he knew something we didn't. Then he just mumbled something about being careful and drove off into the woods. We kind of laughed it off, figured he was just some weirdo who lived out here. But looking back, that dude gave me the creeps. Like, seriously bad vibes. Anyway, we got the tents up just as the rain started coming down harder. We huddled under the tarp, trying to get a fire going. The mood was still good, everyone was joking around, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something was off. Like we were being watched. The rain was seriously coming down now, like a constant drumming on the tarp. We managed to get a fire going, thank God, and huddled around it, shivering in our damp clothes. Ben was already complaining about the cold, typical Ben. Dude, I can't feel my toes, he whined, shoving his feet closer to the flames. I knew we should have brought those extra blankets. Chris, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood. Come on, man, it's not that bad. Think of it as an adventure. Survival of the fittest. I tried to laugh along, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The wind howled through the trees, and every time a branch snapped, I swore my heart jumped. The woods were dark, man, like really dark. The kind of darkness that seems to press in on you, you know. We cooked up some hot dogs and beans on the fire, the kind of gourmet camping food we were known for. The rain kept falling, and the firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the trees. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving in the darkness beyond the firelight, but when I looked closer, there was nothing there. Did you guys see that? I asked, trying to sound casual. See what? Mark said, his mouth full of hot dog. I thought I saw something moving in the trees, I said, trying to peer into the darkness. Probably just a raccoon or something, Chris said, shrugging. Don't worry about it. But I was worried. The whole atmosphere was just off. The wind seemed to whisper secrets, and the trees seemed to be watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. As the night wore on, the rain kept falling and the fire started to die down. We huddled closer together, trying to stay warm and dry. The silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the sound of the rain. But then I heard it. A low growl deep in the woods. Did you hear that? I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. The others nodded, their faces pale in the firelight. We listened intently, but the growl didn't come again. Probably just a bear, Mark said, trying to sound brave. But I wasn't convinced. That growl, it sounded different. More menacing. Like something hungry. We decided to take turns keeping watch, just in case. I volunteered to go first, even though I was terrified. I sat by the dying embers of the fire, my eyes scanning the darkness, my ears straining for any sound. The rain kept falling, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the beat of my own heart. And that's when I saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing in the darkness, watching me. The eyes blinked, and I swear my heart stopped. They were these eerie yellow things, like a cat's, but way bigger. They stared right at me through the darkness, unblinking, and I felt this chill crawl down my spine. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it in the direction of the eyes, but they were gone. Vanished. I told the guys what I saw, but they just laughed it off. Dude, you're seeing things, Mark said, yawning. It's just the lack of sleep and all this rain messing with your head. Maybe he was right. I mean, it was dark, and the rain was distorting everything. But I knew what I saw. Those eyes, they were real. We tried to get some sleep, but it was impossible. The rain kept pounding on the tent, and the wind howled like a banshee. Every little creak and groan of the trees sounded like someone sneaking up on us. I kept imagining those eyes watching me from the darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. When morning finally came, we were all exhausted and on edge. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky was still overcast, and the air was thick with humidity. We made some coffee and tried to act normal, but the tension was thick. Maybe we should pack up and head back, Ben suggested, his voice shaky. This place is giving me the creeps. Don't be such a wimp, Ben, Chris said, trying to sound tough. We just got here. We can't leave now. But even Chris sounded a little unsure of himself. We decided to try and salvage the day. We went for a hike, hoping to clear our heads and enjoy the scenery. But the woods were still creepy, even in the daylight. The trees were tall and dense, blocking out most of the sunlight. The ground was damp and muddy, and every step we took was accompanied by the sucking sound of our boots pulling free of the muck. As we were hiking, I noticed something strange. There were these weird symbols carved into some of the trees. They looked like crude drawings of animals and humans with distorted limbs and twisted faces. They were unsettling, to say the least. "What do you think these are?" I asked, pointing to one of the symbols. "Probably just some kids messing around," Mark said, but he didn't sound convinced. We kept hiking, but the symbols kept appearing more and more frequently. They were everywhere, on trees, on rocks, even on the ground. It was like we were being watched, followed. As we were heading back to camp, the sun started to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The woods seemed to darken, and the air grew colder. We picked up our pace, eager to get back to the relative safety of our campsite. But as we rounded a bend in the trail, we froze. Standing in the middle of the path, bathed in the fading light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs. Its head was elongated, and its face was a grotesque mask of animal features. It was like something out of a nightmare. We stared at it in horror, unable to move, unable to speak. And then it turned its head and looked at us. Its eyes were those same eerie yellow eyes I had seen in the darkness the night before. We just stood there, frozen, staring at this thing. It was like a twisted version of a human, all lanky and wrong. Its skin seemed to stretch too tight over its bones, and its eyes, those eyes were burning into me. I felt this wave of pure terror wash over me, and I just knew that we were in serious danger. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished. 1 minute it was there, the next it was gone, like it had melted into the shadows. We were left standing there, panting, hearts pounding, staring at the empty path. What the hell was that? Ben stammered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But we need to get out of here. Now!" We turned and ran back to camp, not stopping until we reached the relative safety of the firelight. We huddled together, whispering in hushed tones, trying to make sense of what we had seen. Maybe it was just a crazy homeless guy, Chris suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. "No way," Mark said, shaking his head. That was something else. Something not human. We decided to stay up all night, taking turns keeping watch. We built up the fire, hoping the flames would keep whatever we had seen at bay. But the fear was still there, gnawing at us, whispering in the back of our minds. Every time a branch snapped or an owl hooted, we jumped, our hearts in our throats. The woods seemed to be alive with unseen eyes, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. As the night wore on, the tension grew thicker. We were exhausted, scared, and starting to lose it. Ben was on the verge of a breakdown, and even Chris, the tough guy, was looking pale. Just before dawn, I heard it. A scratching sound coming from outside my tent. It was soft at first, then it got louder, more insistent. Like something was trying to get in. I held my breath, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching continued, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. There was a moment of silence, then a thud, like something heavy had landed on the ground. I held my breath, waiting, but there was no other sound. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The first rays of dawn were just starting to filter through the trees, casting a pale light on the campsite. I scanned the area, but there was nothing there. Then I saw it. A footprint in the mud just outside my tent. It was huge, way bigger than any human foot. And it had these long, claw-like marks, like something out of a horror movie. I stumbled back into the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew then that we weren't dealing with just some random creature. This was something else. Something ancient, something evil. And it was hunting us. I showed the guys the footprint, and any lingering doubts they had vanished. We were officially freaking out. Ben was practically catatonic, Chris was cursing up a storm, and even Mark, the level-headed one, looked like he was about to lose it. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "This isn't safe. Whatever that thing is, it's hunting us." We packed up our gear as fast as we could, throwing everything into the Jeep haphazardly. We didn't care about being organized anymore. We just wanted to get out of that cursed forest. As we were driving away, I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see that creature chasing after us. The woods seemed to press in on either side of the road, like they were trying to swallow us whole. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. We found a motel and crashed there, too exhausted and scared to even think about food or showers. We just collapsed on the beds, fully clothed, and fell into a deep, uneasy sleep. When we woke up the next morning, the sun was shining and the birds were singing. It felt like a different world from the nightmare we had experienced in the forest. We were still shaken, but we were alive. We decided to head back home, figuring we had had enough of camping for a lifetime. But as we were driving, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't out of the woods yet. There was something about that creature, something that told me it wasn't finished with us. And I was right. A few days later, I was at home, trying to get back to normal life. But I couldn't concentrate. I kept replaying the events of that weekend in my mind over and over again. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't focus. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to get to sleep, when I heard it. A whisper just outside my window. It was faint, almost inaudible, but I heard it. It was a voice, raspy and deep, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I listened intently, but the whisper was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next night, it happened again. The whisper outside my window, speaking in that strange language. This time, it was louder, closer. I could almost make out the words. I got out of bed and crept towards the window. I peered out cautiously, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness and the wind rustling through the trees. I was about to turn away when I heard it again. The whisper right next to my ear. "You can't hide," it said, in a voice that sent chills down my spine. "I will find you." I spun around, but there was no one there. I was alone in my room, but I just knew that the creature from the woods had found me. I didn't get a wink of sleep that night. Every little creak in the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sent my heart racing. I kept imagining the creature lurking in the shadows, waiting to snatch me away. The next morning, I called Mark and Chris, told them about the whispers. They were freaked out, too, but we all agreed that we couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever it was to come for us. We decided to stick together, figuring there was safety in numbers. We met up at Mark's place, and the atmosphere was thick with fear and paranoia. We were constantly looking over our shoulders, jumping at shadows, and scrutinizing every stranger who walked by. "What do we do?" Chris asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "We can't just stay locked up in here forever." "I don't know," I admitted, feeling helpless. "But we need to figure something out. We need to find a way to stop this thing." We spent the next few days researching, trying to find any information about what we had encountered in the woods. We scoured the internet, read old books, even talked to some local experts on folklore and mythology. But we couldn't find anything that matched the description of the creature we had seen. Then, the unthinkable happened. Ben disappeared. One minute he was there, sitting with us in Mark's living room. The next he was gone. Vanished without a trace. We searched the house, the neighborhood, everywhere we could think of, but there was no sign of him. The police were called, but they were no help. They treated us like we were crazy, like we were making the whole thing up. They said Ben probably just ran away, or maybe he was involved in something shady and was trying to lay low. But we knew better. We knew that whatever had taken Ben was the same thing that had been haunting us since that night in the woods. And we knew that we were next. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over. We were terrified, desperate, and completely alone. We knew that we couldn't rely on anyone else to help us. We had to take matters into our own hands. We decided to go back to Black Ridge Forest. We knew it was a risky move, but we had to find Ben. And we had to stop that creature before it claimed another victim. As we drove back into the forest, the familiar sense of dread washed over me. The trees seemed to loom over us, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the cawing of a crow. We parked the Jeep at the edge of the campground and stepped out into the eerie stillness. The place was deserted, the campsites empty. The only sign that anyone had ever been there was the charred remains of our campfire from that fateful night. We walked slowly towards the spot where we had last seen Ben. The ground was damp and spongy beneath our feet, and the air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. As we reached the clearing, we stopped dead in our tracks. In the center of the clearing, hanging from a tree, was Ben's backpack. It was ripped and torn, its contents scattered on the ground. And next to it, scrawled in the dirt, was a message written in what looked like blood. "You're next." The sight of Ben's backpack, hanging there like a macabre trophy, sent a wave of nausea through me. The message scrawled in the dirt was a chilling reminder that we were dealing with something truly evil. "Oh my God, Ben." Chris choked out, his voice cracking. Mark was pale and silent, his jaw clenched tight. I could see the fear in his eyes, but also a steely determination. We were all scared, but we weren't going to back down. We owed it to Ben to find out what happened to him. We cautiously approached the backpack, our eyes scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of movement. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the pounding of our hearts. As I reached for the backpack, I noticed something glinting in the sunlight. It was a small, silver object lying on the ground beneath the tree. I picked it up and examined it closely. It was a pendant shaped like a wolf's head with glowing red eyes. I recognized it instantly. It was Ben's pendant, the one he always wore. He had gotten it from his grandfather, who was Native American. Ben had told me once that the pendant was a protective talisman meant to ward off evil spirits, but it hadn't protected him. As I was holding the pendant, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a sense of dread washed over me. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that we were being watched. I looked up slowly, my eyes scanning the trees. And then I saw it. Standing in the shadows, partially hidden by the thick foliage, was the creature. It was even more terrifying than I remembered. Its body was tall and gaunt, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its skin was a sickly grayish green, stretched tight over its bones. Its head was elongated, with a snout-like face and glowing yellow eyes. And its mouth was filled with rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It was a skinwalker. The creature stared at us with its cold, predatory eyes. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us, its presence radiating an aura of pure evil. I felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a paralyzing fear. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape that horrifying sight. But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by the creature's malevolent gaze. Then, the skinwalker smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile, revealing its rows of razor-sharp teeth. And in that moment, I knew that we were doomed. The skinwalker lunged. It moved with an unnatural speed, a blur of limbs and teeth. I screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a tree root. I fell to the ground, my heart pounding in my chest. Mark and Chris reacted instantly. They grabbed rocks and branches from the ground and charged at the creature, yelling and screaming. The skinwalker snarled and swiped at them with its claws, its eyes burning with rage. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from that thing. I could hear Mark and Chris shouting behind me, their voices filled with fear and desperation. I ran through the trees, my lungs burning, my legs aching. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in on me like a suffocating embrace. I could hear the skinwalker crashing through the undergrowth behind me, its growls echoing through the trees. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands and knees on the rough ground. I scrambled back to my feet and kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the creature gaining on me, its presence looming over me like a dark cloud. I burst out of the trees and into a clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, abandoned cabin. I didn't hesitate. I ran towards the cabin, hoping it would offer some kind of refuge. I slammed the door shut behind me and fumbled for the lock. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key in the hole. Finally, I managed to turn the lock just as the Skinwalker reached the cabin. The creature slammed against the door, its claws scraping against the wood. I could hear it snarling and growling, its breath hot and fetid against the door. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The Skinwalker continued to batter the door, its strength incredible. The wood splintered and cracked under the onslaught. I knew it was only a matter of time before the creature broke through. I looked around the cabin frantically, searching for a weapon, an escape route, anything. But there was nothing. Just a few old pieces of furniture and a fireplace filled with ashes. The door creaked and groaned under the creature's relentless assault. I knew I had to do something, anything, to survive. I grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the fireplace and braced myself for the inevitable. The door burst open, and the Skinwalker lunged into the cabin. I swung the poker with all my might, catching the creature on the side of the head. The Skinwalker roared in pain and stumbled backward. I pressed my advantage, swinging the poker again and again, driving the creature back towards the door. The Skinwalker snarled and lashed out with its claws, catching me on the arm. I cried out in pain, but I didn't let go of the poker. I kept swinging, forcing the creature back out of the cabin. Finally, with a desperate lunge, I managed to push the Skinwalker out the door. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I leaned against the door, my body trembling, my arm throbbing. I had managed to fend off the creature, but I knew it wasn't over. The Skinwalker was still out there, waiting for another chance to strike. I had to find a way to escape. I didn't know how long I stayed in that cabin, huddled in the corner, clutching the iron poker like a lifeline. Time seemed to blur, every sound outside sending a jolt of fear through me. The sunlight filtering through the grimy windows slowly faded, plunging the cabin into an eerie twilight. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. The Skinwalker was still out there, and it wouldn't give up easily. I had to find a way to escape, to get back to civilization, to warn others about the danger lurking in these woods. With a deep breath, I forced myself to move. My arm was throbbing, the claw marks deep and painful, but I had to keep going. I cautiously opened the cabin door, peering out into the gathering darkness. The forest was silent, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. I crept out of the cabin, my senses on high alert. I moved slowly, keeping to the shadows, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the creature. The forest seemed to hold its breath, watching me, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled upon a narrow dirt road. Relief washed over me. A road meant people, meant civilization, meant safety. I started walking, my pace quickening with every step. As I walked, I heard the sound of voices in the distance. My heart leaped with hope. People. I wasn't alone. I broke into a run, my legs aching, my lungs burning, but I didn't care. I had to reach those voices to find help. I rounded a bend in the road and saw them. A group of hikers, 3 men and 2 women, were gathered around a campfire, laughing and talking. I rushed towards them, waving my arms, shouting. They looked up in surprise as I approached, their faces etched with concern. I stumbled towards them, my words tumbling out in a rush, a jumbled mix of fear and relief. "Help me," I gasped. "There's something in the woods, a creature, it's dangerous." The hikers exchanged worried glances. One of the men, a tall, burly guy with a beard, stepped forward. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm and reassuring. "What did you see?" I took a deep breath, trying to compose myself. I told them about the Skinwalker, about Ben's disappearance, about the attack on the cabin. They listened intently, their faces growing grim. When I finished my story, the bearded man nodded slowly. "We've heard stories about something like that," he said. "A creature that roams these woods, preying on those who wander too far from the path." He looked at the other hikers, and they nodded in agreement. "We'll help you," he said. "We'll get you out of here." A wave of gratitude washed over me. I was safe. I was with people who believed me, who were willing to help. But even as I felt the relief, a cold dread crept into my heart. I had led the Skinwalker to them. Just then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. We all spun around to see one of the women, her face contorted in terror, pointing towards the trees. Emerging from the shadows, its eyes glowing like burning coals, was the Skinwalker. Panic erupted. The hikers scrambled to their feet, their faces pale with terror. The Skinwalker let out a terrifying shriek, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire forest. It lunged at the group, its claws outstretched, its eyes burning with a predatory hunger. The bearded man yelled, "Run! Get out of here!" We scattered in all directions, the Skinwalker hot on our heels. I could hear the creature crashing through the undergrowth, its snarls and growls echoing through the trees. I didn't look back, I just ran, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I could hear the screams of the other hikers, their voices growing fainter as the creature picked them off one by one. The sounds of the chase, the snapping branches, the terrified cries, were a horrifying symphony of chaos and death. I burst out of the trees and onto the dirt road. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The image of the Skinwalker, its twisted form and glowing eyes, was burned into my mind. I knew it was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, hunting me. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until my legs gave out and I collapsed on the side of the road. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. As I lay there, I heard a sound in the distance. A vehicle approaching. Headlights pierced the darkness, growing closer and closer. A truck pulled up beside me, and a man leaned out the window. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough but concerned. I nodded weakly, unable to speak. The man helped me into the truck, and I collapsed onto the seat, my body racked with sobs. I was safe, for now. but the memory of the Skinwalker and the fate of the hikers would haunt me forever. As the truck pulled away, I looked back at the dark forest, its silhouette stark against the night sky. I could almost feel the creature's presence, its malevolent eyes watching me from the shadows. I knew then that the Skinwalker was still out there, waiting for its next victim. And I knew that I would never be truly safe. I've always been drawn to the wilderness, to the solitude and silence that you can only find miles away from civilization. There's a thrill in testing your limits, in relying on your own skills and instincts to survive in the raw embrace of nature. I've done my fair share of solo camping trips, exploring different national parks and forests, each with its own unique beauty and challenges. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of Redwood National Park. Redwood, with its towering trees and dense undergrowth, has always held a certain mystique for me. It's a place where you can easily feel small and insignificant, a reminder of the vastness and power of the natural world. I had been planning this trip for months, eager to lose myself in the serenity of the ancient forest. I packed my gear with meticulous care, ensuring I had everything I needed for a week-long adventure. The drive to the park was uneventful, the anticipation building with every mile. As I entered the park gates, a sense of calm washed over me, the worries of everyday life fading into the background. I followed the winding road deeper into the forest, the sunlight filtering through the canopy of leaves, creating an ethereal glow. I found the perfect spot to set up camp, a secluded clearing near a small stream. The air was crisp and clean, with the scent of pine needles and damp earth filling my nostrils. I pitched my tent with practiced ease, the familiar routine grounding me in the present moment. As I gathered firewood and prepared a simple meal, I couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. This was exactly what I needed, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with myself. Little did I know that this peaceful solitude would soon be shattered, replaced by a primal fear that would haunt me forever. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows through the dense trees. I decided to set up camp before it got too dark. I found a relatively flat area near the creek, a little ways off the trail. It was the perfect spot, secluded and quiet, with the gentle sound of the water adding to the peaceful atmosphere. I unfurled my tent, a lightweight but sturdy one-person model I'd used on countless trips before. It was almost comforting, like a familiar friend in this unfamiliar territory. As I staked it down, I noticed how incredibly still everything was. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an eerie silence that seemed to press in on me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the natural calm of the forest at dusk. Next, I gathered firewood. Dead branches and fallen logs littered the forest floor, bone dry and ready to burn. I built a small fire pit, carefully arranging the wood, and soon had a cheerful fire crackling away. The flames danced and flickered, casting an orange glow that pushed back the encroaching darkness. I cooked a simple meal of freeze-dried stew over the fire, the warmth of the flames a welcome comfort against the evening chill. As I ate, I couldn't help but scan my surroundings, my senses on high alert. The silence was still unsettling, and I felt a prickle of unease at the back of my neck. I kept glancing back at the dense undergrowth, half expecting to see a pair of eyes watching me. I knew it was probably just my imagination, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that I wasn't alone. After finishing my meal, I cleaned up and secured my food supplies, hanging them from a tree branch high above the ground. I didn't want any unwanted visitors in the night. As darkness finally enveloped the forest, I retreated to my tent, zipping the entrance securely behind me. I lay down in my sleeping bag, listening to the crackling fire and the distant murmur of the creek. Despite the lingering feeling of unease, exhaustion eventually took over, and I drifted off to sleep. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. I had been jolted from a deep sleep by something. I didn't know what. It was still dark outside, the only light coming from the dying embers of my campfire. I strained my ears, listening for any sound that might explain my sudden awakening. At first, there was nothing but the familiar chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. But then, I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from just outside my tent. Fear gripped me instantly. I held my breath, trying to make out the source of the sound. Was it a bear? A mountain lion? I had no idea. All I knew was that something large and dangerous was lurking just feet away from me. I slowly reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling as I fumbled for the switch. I clicked it on, pointing the beam towards the tent entrance. The thin nylon fabric glowed, revealing the outline of something moving outside. It was big, much bigger than I had imagined. I couldn't make out its exact shape in the darkness, but it was definitely some kind of animal, and it was pacing back and forth just beyond my tent. The growling continued, intermittent but menacing, sending shivers down my spine. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, my mind racing. What should I do? Should I try to scare it away? Or should I just stay quiet and hope it went away on its own? I decided to try making some noise. I banged on the side of the tent and yelled, "Hey, get out of here." My voice sounded weak and shaky even to my own ears. The growling stopped for a moment, and I held my breath, hoping I had scared it off. But then, I heard a heavy thud, like something had bumped against the tent. I flinched, my heart leaping into my throat. The creature outside was still there, and it seemed to be getting closer. I spent the rest of the night in a state of terror, listening to the creature's movements outside my tent. It paced, it growled, it occasionally bumped against the nylon fabric, each sound sending a fresh wave of fear through me. I didn't dare close my eyes, afraid of what might happen if I let my guard down. As the hours crawled by, I felt a growing sense of despair. I was trapped, alone in the wilderness with a predator that clearly wasn't afraid of me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the first hint of dawn began to break. The darkness outside my tent started to fade, replaced by a dim gray light. I held my breath, listening intently. The growling had stopped. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to have retreated. Cautiously, I unzipped my tent a few inches and peered out. The forest was still shrouded in a hazy mist, but I could see more clearly now. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. And then I saw it. About 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a thick redwood trunk, was the creature. It was huge, easily the size of a large bear, but it was definitely not a bear. It was something I had never seen before, something that seemed out of place in this world. Its fur was a dark, mottled gray, blending in perfectly with the shadows of the forest. It had a long, muscular body with thick legs and powerful claws. But it was the creature's head that truly terrified me. It was elongated and almost wolf-like, with a narrow snout filled with sharp teeth. But its eyes, they were unlike anything I had ever seen. They were large and round, and they glowed with an eerie yellow light, even in the dim morning light. They seemed to pierce through me, seeing right into my soul. The creature stood there for a moment, its gaze fixed on me. I felt a wave of pure, primal fear wash over me. I was paralyzed, unable to move or even breathe. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature turned and melted back into the dense undergrowth. I remained in the tent for a long time, my body trembling, my mind trying to process what I had just seen. What was that thing? Where had it come from? And why had it been stalking me? I knew I had to get out of there, but I was terrified to leave the relative safety of my tent. I was alone, injured, and vulnerable in the heart of the wilderness, with a creature of unknown origin lurking nearby. The sun climbed higher, but the warmth of the day did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I knew I couldn't stay huddled in my tent forever. I had to make a decision, and fast. My options were limited: stay put and hope the creature didn't return, or try to make my way back to the trail and find help. Staying put seemed like the safest option, at least for now. I had food and water, and the tent offered some protection, however flimsy. But what if the creature came back? What if it was waiting for me to come out? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. The other option was to risk it and try to reach the trail. But I was injured, and the terrain was rough. And what if I ran into the creature again? I didn't like the odds. I decided to try and assess the situation. Carefully, I unzipped the tent again and peered out. There was no sign of the creature. I took a deep breath and crawled out of the tent, wincing as I put weight on my injured ankle. I grabbed my hiking poles for support and slowly made my way around the campsite, scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of movement. The forest was eerily quiet. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was as if the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I circled the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of the creature. Maybe it was really gone. Maybe I was safe. But as I turned back towards my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft earth near the edge of the clearing, were a set of enormous paw prints. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before, huge and clawed, with an almost reptilian quality to them. They were fresh, too, the impression still sharp in the damp soil. The creature was still out there. It had been watching me the whole time. Panic welled up inside me. I stumbled back to the tent, my ankle throbbing with pain. I had to get out of there, but where could I go? The trail was miles away, and I could barely walk. I felt trapped, like a mouse cornered by a cat. My first instinct was to call for help. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking so badly I could barely dial the number. I held it up, desperately searching for a signal. Nothing. Just the empty bars mocking me from the screen. Of course, there was no signal. I was in the middle of nowhere. I sank to the ground, my back against a tree trunk, feeling utterly defeated. What was I going to do? I couldn't stay here, and I couldn't leave. I was completely at the mercy of this creature, this thing that I didn't even understand. A surge of adrenaline jolted me back into action. I couldn't just give up. I had to fight for my survival. I scanned my surroundings, looking for anything that could be used as a weapon. A rock, a branch, but what good would that do against a creature that size? Then I remembered my bear spray. I had packed it as a precaution, just in case I encountered a bear on the trail. I scrambled through my backpack, my fingers frantically searching for the canister. There it was. I pulled it out, clutching it like a lifeline. But as I held the can in my hand, doubt crept in. Would it even be effective against this creature? It was unlike anything I had ever encountered before. Would bear spray even phase it? I had no other choice. It was my only hope. I gripped the canister tightly, my finger hovering over the trigger. I would wait. I would listen. And when the creature came back, I would be ready. Time seemed to crawl by. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I sat hunched in the entrance of my tent, bear spray clutched tightly in my hand, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The sun was high now, the forest bathed in an eerie midday light. The silence was almost unbearable, a suffocating blanket of tension that pressed down on me. I tried to distract myself, to focus on anything but the fear that gnawed at my insides. I thought about my family, my friends, the life I had left behind. I thought about all the things I still wanted to do, all the places I still wanted to see. Was this how it was going to end? Alone in the wilderness, hunted by a creature I couldn't even name? Then I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. It was a low, guttural growl, the same sound I had heard the night before. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, the same place where I had seen the creature disappear. My grip tightened on the bear spray. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I was ready. The growling grew louder, closer. I could hear the creature moving through the undergrowth, its heavy footsteps crushing the dry leaves. I held my breath, trying to pinpoint its location. Then it emerged from the trees. It was even more terrifying in the daylight. Its fur seemed darker, its eyes more menacing. It moved with a sinuous grace, its muscles rippling beneath its thick hide. It was a predator in its element, and I was its prey. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, its gaze fixed on me. I could feel its power, its hunger. It was toying with me, savoring the moment before the kill. I knew I had to act fast. I raised the bear spray, aiming it at the creature's face. My finger trembled on the trigger. This was it. This was my last chance. I pressed the trigger, and a cloud of red pepper spray erupted from the canister. It hit the creature square in the face, and for a moment it seemed to stagger back. It let out a roar, a sound of pure rage and pain, and clawed at its eyes. I felt a surge of hope. Maybe this would work after all. But the hope was short-lived. The creature shook its head, and the effect of the spray seemed to wear off quickly. Its eyes, now bloodshot and furious, locked onto me again. It lunged forward, its massive body a blur of motion. I screamed and scrambled back, tripping over my own feet. I fell to the ground, the bear spray skittering away from my grasp. The creature was on top of me in an instant, its hot, fetid breath on my face. I could smell the stench of its fur, the musky odor of a wild animal. Its claws raked across my arm, tearing through my jacket and into my flesh. I cried out in pain, but the sound was drowned out by the creature's snarls. It pinned me down, its weight crushing my chest. I struggled to breathe, my lungs burning. I thought it was the end. I closed my eyes, waiting for the final blow. But it never came. Instead, I heard a series of loud cracks, like branches snapping under immense pressure. I opened my eyes to see the creature thrashing and writhing, its body convulsing. It let out a series of agonizing roars, its eyes rolling back in its head. Then, with a final shudder, it went limp. I lay there for a moment, stunned and disbelieving. The creature was dead. But how? What had happened? Then I saw it. A large tree branch, snapped off by the wind, had fallen directly onto the creature, crushing its skull. It was a freak accident, a stroke of luck that defied all odds. I was alive. I had survived. I slowly got to my feet, my legs shaking, my body trembling with shock. I looked down at the creature, its lifeless eyes staring blankly at the sky. It was an unsettling sight, a stark reminder of the danger I had just faced. But there was also a sense of relief, a wave of gratitude that washed over me. I was alive. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I needed to get out of there, to get back to civilization. But first, I had to tend to my wounds. My arm was throbbing, the deep gashes from the creature's claws bleeding steadily. I rummaged through my first aid kit, my hands still shaking. I cleaned the wounds as best I could and bandaged them with gauze. Then, with a heavy heart, I began to pack up my camp. I took down the tent, gathered my belongings, and stuffed everything into my backpack. I looked around the campsite one last time, a shiver running down my spine. This place, once a haven of peace and solitude, was now forever tainted by the memory of the creature. I started the long trek back to the trailhead, leaning heavily on my hiking poles. My ankle was still swollen and painful, but I gritted my teeth and kept moving. I needed to get out of the forest, to get away from the creature's territory. The journey was agonizingly slow. Every step sent a jolt of pain through my ankle, and my arm throbbed with each movement. But I kept pushing forward, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate need to escape. As I walked, I couldn't help but think about the creature. What was it? Where had it come from? And why had it attacked me? I had no answers, only questions that haunted my thoughts. The forest seemed different now, darker and more menacing. The shadows seemed to hold hidden dangers, and the silence was filled with unseen threats. I felt a constant sense of unease, a feeling that I was being watched. But I kept walking. I had to. I had to get back to safety. I finally stumbled out of the forest, blinking in the bright sunlight. The parking lot seemed surreal, a jarring contrast to the nightmare I had just endured. My car was there, a beacon of safety and normalcy. I fumbled with my keys, my hands still shaking, and unlocked the door. I sank into the driver's seat, my body aching, my mind exhausted. I took a deep breath, trying to process everything that had happened. I had faced death, and I had survived. But at what cost? I looked down at my bandaged arm, a physical reminder of the creature's attack. The scars would heal, but the memories would remain etched into my mind forever. I would never forget the terror, the helplessness, the feeling of being hunted. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the forest behind. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature following me. I knew I would never be the same. The experience had changed me, shaken me to my core. I had always considered myself a rational person, a skeptic. But now, I wasn't so sure. I had seen something that defied explanation, something that challenged my understanding of the natural world. The encounter had left me with more questions than answers. What was that creature? Was it a known species, or something entirely new? Was it a lone predator, or were there others like it out there? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I drove for hours, the silence in the car broken only by the hum of the engine and my own troubled thoughts. I stopped at a small town, checked into a motel, and collapsed onto the bed. I slept for what felt like days, haunted by nightmares of the creature and the forest. When I finally woke, I felt drained, both physically and emotionally. I knew I needed to get back to my life, to my job, to my family and friends. But I also knew that I would never be able to forget what I had experienced. The wind howled like a banshee, whipping across the barren landscape and rattling the windows of our makeshift barracks. Dust devils danced across the parched earth, kicking up swirls of red sand that stung my eyes and grated against my teeth. This was Camp Bastion, our home away from home, a desolate outpost smack dab in the middle of nowhere. I squinted at the horizon, where the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. Another day in paradise, I thought wryly, as I trudged back to my bunk after a mind-numbing shift at the watchtower. The days here blurred together into a monotonous routine. Wake up, choke down some lukewarm chow, patrol the perimeter, stand guard duty, rinse and repeat. The only thing that broke the monotony was the ever-present sense of unease that hung in the air like a thick fog. We were stationed in a remote corner of Afghanistan, a place where the shadows seemed to stretch a little longer and the silence was a little too profound. The locals whispered tales of strange creatures that roamed the night, things that made your blood run cold. We dismissed them as old wives' tales, of course, but there was a primal fear that gnawed at the edges of our bravado. Tonight, that fear felt a little closer, a little more real. As I lay on my bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something ancient and malevolent lurking just beyond the perimeter of our feeble lights. I tried to brush it off, blaming the isolation and the eerie quiet that always descended upon the camp after nightfall. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something out there, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. And I had a feeling it was getting closer. The next day, my apprehension hadn't faded. If anything, it had intensified. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the already arid landscape into a furnace. Sweat trickled down my back, stinging my eyes, but the heat wasn't the only thing making me uncomfortable. There was a prickling sensation on my skin, like I was being watched. As dusk approached, the familiar dread returned with a vengeance. Tonight was my turn for solo patrol duty, a 6-hour shift circling the perimeter of the base. I checked my rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready, and slung it over my shoulder. My flashlight, a trusty mag light, felt reassuringly heavy in my hand. Stepping out into the twilight, I was immediately swallowed by the silence. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel path and the distant hum of the generators back at the base. The shadows stretched long and distorted, playing tricks on my eyes. Every rock, every bush, seemed to morph into a lurking figure. I tried to focus on the task at hand, scanning the horizon for any signs of movement, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the stories the locals told. Stories of creatures that could mimic human voices, creatures that could slip in and out of the shadows unseen, creatures that preyed on the weak and the isolated. A sudden rustle in the nearby bushes sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I swung my flashlight towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just a desert fox, its eyes gleaming in the beam of light. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But the encounter had rattled me. My senses were on high alert, every nerve ending tingling with anticipation. As I continued my patrol, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was something out there, watching me from the darkness, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty ground and the scraggly bushes that lined the perimeter fence. The wind had picked up, whistling through the barbed wire like a mournful spirit. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter around me. It was then that I saw it. In the distance, beyond the fence, something moved. It was a flicker of movement at first, barely perceptible against the backdrop of the moonlit fields. I stopped in my tracks, straining my eyes to get a better look. The movement continued, growing more pronounced. It wasn't the natural gait of an animal, not the graceful stride of a deer or the scampering of a rodent. This was something different, something wrong. The figure, if you could call it that, moved in a series of jerky, disjointed motions. It was tall and lanky, its limbs contorting at unnatural angles. It seemed to glide across the terrain, its feet barely touching the ground. I raised my binoculars, trying to get a clearer view. The image swam into focus, and my breath caught in my throat. It was humanoid in shape, but that's where the resemblance ended. Its body seemed to be made of shadows, constantly shifting and morphing. And then there were the eyes, 2 points of crimson light that burned with an unholy intensity. Fear gripped me, cold and paralyzing. I wanted to run, to scream for help, but my legs felt like lead. I was rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the horrifying spectacle unfolding before me. What the hell was that thing? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a hallucination, a trick of the light? Or was it something far more sinister, something that defied all logic and reason? Whatever it was getting closer. My mind rebelled against what my eyes were showing me. It had to be a trick of the light, a mirage thrown up by the heat and dust. Maybe it was just a weirdly shaped tree branch swaying in the wind. Yeah, that was it. A tree branch. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. The way it moved, the way it seemed to glide effortlessly across the uneven terrain, it wasn't natural. It was like something out of a nightmare. I lowered the binoculars, my hands shaking. My pulse hammered in my ears, and a cold sweat slicked my palms. I wanted to turn tail and run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But something held me back. Call it morbid curiosity, call it a soldier's sense of duty, but I couldn't just ignore it. I had to know what I was dealing with. Maybe it was just some lost, confused animal. Maybe it was harmless. Yeah, right. And maybe monkeys could fly out of my ass. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to get a closer look. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a compulsion I couldn't resist. Taking a deep breath, I gripped my rifle tighter and started walking towards the fence. Each step felt heavy, each crunch of gravel under my boots amplified in the silence. The figure in the distance remained in my sights, its movements becoming more erratic, more predatory. The rational part of my brain screamed at me to turn back, to get the hell out of there. But something else, something primal and instinctive, urged me forward. I had to see it up close. I had to know. The fence loomed before me, a barrier between the relative safety of the base and the unknown horrors that lurked beyond. I gripped the cold metal mesh, my knuckles white, and peered through the gaps. The figure was closer now, maybe 100 yards away. It moved with an unsettling fluidity, its limbs bending at impossible angles. It was like watching a stop-motion animation come to life, each frame slightly off, slightly disturbing. I could hear it now, a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. It was a sound that made my skin crawl, a sound that spoke of ancient evils and primal fears. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of the night. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal fight or flight response kicking in. But instead of fleeing, I found myself drawn closer, compelled by a morbid fascination. I cautiously climbed over the fence, the barbed wire snagging on my uniform. Ignoring the sharp sting, I dropped to the ground on the other side. The world seemed to tilt, the familiar landscape transformed into something alien and menacing. The creature was still there, its silhouette stark against the moonlit sky. It seemed to be aware of my presence, its head cocked to one side, those crimson eyes burning into me. I raised my rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger. My breath came in ragged gasps, my body trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. What was I doing? This was insane. I should be back at the base, safe behind the fence. But something, some unseen force, was pulling me towards the creature, urging me to confront the unknown. I took another step, then another, the distance between us slowly closing. The guttural sounds grew louder, filling my ears, drowning out the frantic beating of my heart. I was going to see what this thing was, even if it was the last thing I ever did. 50 yards. 40. 30. With every step, the guttural sounds grew louder, morphing into a series of rasping breaths and clicking noises. The stench of decay wafted towards me, making my stomach churn. And then I saw it. Clearly. It wasn't human. Not anymore. It stood on two legs, tall and gaunt, its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles. Its skin was a patchwork of matted fur and rotting flesh, stretched taut over bone. Its face. God, its face. It was a grotesque mockery of human features, with a gaping maw filled with jagged teeth and eyes that burned with an infernal red light. This was no lost hiker, no wild animal. This was something else entirely. This was a skinwalker. The legends were true. The stories whispered around campfires, the tales that sent shivers down your spine, they were all true. I stood there, frozen in place, my mind unable to comprehend the horror before me. The rifle in my hands felt suddenly inadequate, a child's toy against an ancient evil. The skinwalker tilted its head, studying me with those malevolent eyes. A low growl rumbled from its throat, and it took a step towards me. Panic surged through me, a tidal wave of fear that threatened to drown me. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a loose rock. I fell to the ground, the rifle clattering away from me. The skinwalker let out a shriek, a high-pitched, ear-splitting sound that seemed to pierce my very soul. It lunged towards me, its claws outstretched, its jaws open in a silent snarl. I scrambled back, my hands scrabbling for purchase on the loose dirt. But it was too late. The creature was upon me, its fetid breath hot on my face, its eyes burning into mine. This was it. This was how I was going to die. Alone, in the middle of nowhere, torn apart by a creature out of legend. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as the creature's rancid breath washed over me, a guttural howl ripped through the night. It wasn't coming from the skinwalker. It was coming from behind me. The skinwalker froze, its head snapping towards the source of the sound. I seized the opportunity, scrambling away from its grasp. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest, and my lungs burned with the effort of breathing. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could hear the creature moving, its heavy footsteps pounding the earth behind me. It was chasing me. Adrenaline surged through my veins, fueling my flight. I ran like I'd never run before, my legs pumping, my arms flailing. The rough terrain tore at my boots, and the barbed wire fence loomed in the distance, a beacon of hope in the sea of darkness. The owls continued, echoing across the desolate landscape. They were getting closer. Whatever had made that sound, it was following us. And it was pissed. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The Skinwalker was gaining on me, its long strides eating up the distance between us. Its eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, and its jaws were open in a silent snarl. Fear lent wings to my feet. I sprinted towards the fence, my lungs burning, my muscles screaming for respite. The barbed wire was getting closer, but so was the Skinwalker. I could hear its ragged breathing behind me, feel its hot breath on my neck. It was going to catch me. I was going to die. But then, a new sound cut through the night. A deep, guttural roar, followed by a series of snarls and growls. The owls behind me ceased abruptly, replaced by a cacophony of animalistic sounds. The Skinwalker skidded to a halt, its head whipping back and forth, its eyes darting between me and the source of the new sounds. It seemed confused, uncertain. This was my chance. I threw myself at the fence, scrambling over the barbed wire, ignoring the searing pain as the barbs tore at my flesh. I hit the ground on the other side, rolling to my feet and sprinting towards the safety of the base. I didn't stop running until I reached the brightly lit perimeter of Camp Bastion. Collapsing on the ground, I gasped for breath, my body racked with sobs. I was safe. For now. But the memory of the Skinwalker, its grotesque form and burning eyes, would forever be etched into my mind. I didn't slow down. My lungs screamed for air, my legs burned, and my hands were raw and bloody from the fence, but I didn't stop. I burst through the barracks door, panting and wild-eyed. The image of the Skinwalker burned into my brain. The guys inside looked up from their card game, startled by my sudden entrance. What the hell, man? Johnson, a lanky kid from Georgia, drawled, taking a long drag from his cigarette. You look like you've seen a ghost. Horse, I gasped, leaning against the wall, trying to catch my breath. There's something out there. In the fields. They exchanged amused glances. What? Another desert fox got your panties in a twist. Jackson, our resident wise ass, chuckled. No, I started to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I possibly describe what I'd seen? They think I was crazy. Hell, I thought I was crazy. Spit it out, man, Johnson urged, leaning forward, his eyes narrowed. It was a Skinwalker, I blurted out, the word tasting like bile in my mouth. The laughter died in their throats. A heavy silence fell over the room. Even Jackson looked uneasy. You're messing with us, right? Johnson finally said, his voice a little too high-pitched. I wish I was, I muttered, sinking to the floor, my back against the wall. It was real. I saw it. It chased me. They stared at me, their faces a mixture of disbelief and fear. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind howling outside, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurked just beyond the flimsy walls of our barracks. I knew they didn't believe me. How could they? But I didn't care. All I cared about was that I was safe, at least for now. But what about tomorrow night? What about the next night? Would the Skinwalker be back? Would it come for me again? The question swirled in my head, a vortex of fear and uncertainty. I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no escape. The barracks suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind outside, sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that those glowing red eyes were watching me, waiting for me to step outside again. Johnson tried to calm me down, offering me a swig of his whiskey. It burned going down, but it did little to quell the fear gnawing in my insides. Jackson, ever the skeptic, kept muttering about hallucinations and sleep deprivation. But even his bravado seemed forced, his eyes darting nervously towards the door. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, rifles clutched in our hands, listening to the sounds of the night. Every time the wind howled or a coyote yelped in the distance, we jumped, our hearts pounding in our chests. Dawn eventually broke, casting a pale light over the desolate landscape. The tension in the barracks eased slightly, but the fear remained. We were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. I stepped outside, the morning sun warm on my face. The events of the previous night seemed like a bad dream, a figment of my overactive imagination. But the deep scratches on my hands and the lingering fear in my gut told a different story. I scanned the horizon, half expecting to see the Skinwalker standing there, its eyes burning into me. But there was nothing. Just the endless expanse of desert, stretching out as far as the eye could see. Relief washed over me, followed by a wave of exhaustion. I stumbled back inside, collapsing onto my bunk. Sleep claimed me instantly, a deep, dreamless sleep that offered a temporary escape from the horrors of the night. But even in sleep, the fear lingered. I knew that the Skinwalker was out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness. And I knew that it wouldn't be long before it came for me again. The next few days were a blur. I went through the motions, eating, sleeping, patrolling, but my heart wasn't in it. The encounter with the Skinwalker had shaken me to my core. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger. Every sound sent my heart racing. I jumped at the slightest noise, my hand instinctively reaching for my rifle. The guys noticed my unease, but they kept their distance. They'd heard the stories, the whispers about the Skinwalker. They knew that whatever I'd seen out there had changed me. Then, one night, it happened again. I was on patrol, my nerves stretched taut, my senses on high alert. The wind howled through the barbed wire fence, and the moon cast long, eerie shadows across the barren landscape. Suddenly, I saw it. In the distance, a flicker of movement, a tall, gaunt figure gliding across the terrain. The Skinwalker. Panic seized me. I turned to run, but my legs felt like lead. I fumbled for my rifle, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The creature was closer now, its eyes burning with malevolent intensity. I raised the rifle, my finger trembling on the trigger. "Get away from me!" I screamed, my voice cracking with fear. The Skinwalker didn't flinch. It continued its advance, its long limbs carrying it across the ground with an unnatural grace. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked in my hands, the sound of the gunshot echoing across the silent landscape. but the bullet seemed to pass right through the creature. It didn't even slow down. Despair washed over me. I was going to die. There was no escape. But then, as the skinwalker lunged towards me, its claws outstretched, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The creature let out a shriek, a sound of pure rage and frustration. And then, as the sunlight touched its skin, it vanished. I stood there, panting, my heart pounding in my chest. I was alive. I had survived. But the encounter had left its mark. I was no longer the same man I had been before. The skinwalker had shown me a glimpse of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the world, a darkness that I would never be able to forget. I was discharged from the army a few months later. I went back home, tried to pick up the pieces of my life. But the memories of that night in the desert haunted me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to find some way to deal with the trauma. But nothing seemed to work. The skinwalker had taken something from me, something that I would never be able to get back. I still have nightmares. I still see those glowing red eyes in the darkness. And I know that the skinwalker is still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to return. The crisp autumn air whipped through my hair as I wrestled with the tent poles, the excitement of the weekend bubbling inside me. Need a hand there, Butterfingers? Jake's laughter echoed through the clearing, and I shot him a playful glare. Just you wait, I'll have this thing up before you even find the marshmallows. This annual camping trip had become a tradition for our group, me, Jake, Emily, and Chris. We've been friends since high school, and this weekend escape to the depths of Blackwood Forest was our way of recharging and reconnecting. Blackwood was infamous for its eerie legends and spooky stories, which only added to the thrill. We loved swapping those stories around the campfire, half scared, half laughing. This year, though, the stories felt a little too real. The sky had darkened with surprising speed, and a heavy rain began to fall, the fat drops splattering on the canvas of the tent. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees and sending shivers down my spine. Looks like we picked a great weekend for this, huh? Chris yelled over the wind, his voice laced with a hint of nervousness. As the last of the tents were pitched and the fire was crackling, a damp chill settled over the campsite. The smell of wet earth and pine needles filled the air, mingling with the smoke from the fire. Despite the rain, we huddled around the flames, sharing stories and laughter, trying to ignore the growing sense of isolation that the encroaching darkness brought. But even with the cheerful banter and the warmth of the fire, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching us from the depths of the woods. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through me. The woods, usually a source of adventure and excitement, now seemed to hold a sinister presence. And as the night deepened and the rain continued to fall, that feeling only grew stronger. Hours seemed to crawl by as the rain continued its relentless assault on our tent. Sleep was impossible. Every gust of wind that rattled the canvas, every creak of the trees, sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. I could hear Jake tossing and turning next to me, his restless movements echoing my own unease. "You awake?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the drumming of the rain. Yeah, he mumbled back, his voice thick with sleep. Can't get comfortable. This storm's getting worse. A loud crack from the woods made us both jump. We held our breath, listening intently, but the only sound was the relentless rain. Probably just a branch breaking, I said, trying to convince myself as much as Jake. But the unease lingered. We weren't alone out here. That feeling of being watched, which had been a nagging presence at the edge of my awareness all evening, now intensified, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Hey, remember that story Old Man Fitz told us last year? Jake's voice was low, barely a whisper. About the Skinwalker? Old Man Fitz was a local legend himself, a grizzled old woodsman who lived a hermit's life in a cabin deep within Blackwood Forest. He'd always had a story or two to share about the strange things he'd seen in the woods, but the tale of the Skinwalker had stuck with us. The one about the creature that can wear the skin of any animal? I asked, a shiver running down my spine despite the warmth of my sleeping bag. Yeah, that's the one, Jake said. He said it could mimic human voices, lure people away from their camps. I could hear the fear in his voice, and it fueled my own. We lay in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts, the story of the Skinwalker weaving its way into our anxieties. Another snap, closer this time, broke the silence. We both sat up, straining to hear anything over the wind and rain. Then, a low growl, guttural and chilling, echoed through the woods. It wasn't the sound of any animal I'd ever heard before. Fear gripped me, cold and paralyzing. We weren't alone. Something was out there, in the darkness, watching us. And it wasn't human. The fire had dwindled to a pathetic flicker, the rain-soaked logs refusing to catch a light. We need more wood, I stated, the obviousness of the statement hanging heavy in the tense air. No one volunteered. I'll go, I sighed, already dreading the venture into the oppressive darkness. Jake, bless his loyal soul, scrambled to his feet. I'm coming with you. Emily and Chris, pale and wide-eyed, offered no protest. They were frozen, fear clinging to them like the damp night air. Armed with a flashlight and a growing sense of dread, we stepped out of the feeble circle of light cast by the dying fire. The rain hammered against our jackets, the wind whipping the trees into a frenzy. The beam of the flashlight danced erratically, snatching glimpses of the gnarled branches and the thick undergrowth. The woods felt different now. Alive, somehow. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered threat. The further we ventured, the more claustrophobic the woods became, the dense canopy closing in overhead, blocking out what little moonlight managed to pierce the storm clouds. Did you hear that? Jake whispered, his voice tight with apprehension. I strained my ears, but the only sound was the relentless pounding of the rain and the hammering of my own heart. Then I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing motionless between the trees. The flashlight beam flickered across it, revealing a glimpse of pale skin and long, dark hair plastered to its face. It was just there, watching us, its eyes two burning coals in the darkness. Jake. I breathed, my voice caught in my throat. He followed my gaze, his breath hitching in his chest. We stood frozen, the figure mirroring our stillness. Then, with a speed that defied the laws of nature, it was gone. Vanished into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. We didn't speak. Didn't need to. The terror in our eyes spoke volumes. We scrambled back to camp, our pace quickening with every step. The image of the figure burned into our minds. The woods had shown us something we couldn't explain, something that chilled us to the very core. Back in the weak glow of the fire, the fear hung thick in the air. We huddled together, our damp clothes clinging to our chilled bodies. The image of the figure in the woods burned into our minds. What was that thing? Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I don't know, I admitted, my heart still pounding in my chest. But it wasn't human. Chris, normally the most stoic of the group, was pale and shaking. Maybe we should just pack up and leave, he stammered, his voice betraying his fear. The suggestion hung in the air, tempting but impossible. Leaving meant venturing back into those woods, back into the darkness where that thing was waiting. Jake, ever the pragmatist, tried to inject some logic into the situation. We can't leave in this storm. The roads will be treacherous, and we'll be even more vulnerable out there. He was right, of course. But the thought of staying, of spending another night in this place, filled me with dread. As we debated our options, my gaze fell on a nearby tree. Carved into the bark, deep and fresh, was a series of strange symbols. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, a twisted combination of runes and glyphs that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. What the hell is that? I exclaimed, pointing at the tree. We all stared at the symbols, a fresh wave of fear washing over us. They hadn't been there before. Someone, or something, had carved them while we were in the woods. The feeling of being watched intensified, and a cold certainty settled over me. We weren't alone in these woods. And whatever was out there, it was aware of our presence. It was toying with us. The rain showed no sign of abating, and the wind howled like a banshee, tearing through the trees with a vengeance. We huddled closer to the fire, its meager warmth offering little comfort against the growing chill that seemed to seep from the very ground beneath us. Then, a figure emerged from the woods. She walked with an unnatural grace, seemingly unfazed by the torrential downpour. Her long gray hair was plastered to her face, revealing sharp cheekbones and eyes that glittered with an eerie intensity. She wore a long, dark cloak that billowed around her like a shroud. We stared in stunned silence, our fear momentarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected apparition. She stopped a few feet from the fire, her gaze sweeping over us with an unsettling intensity. Her eyes, dark and deep-set, seemed to hold ancient secrets, and a shiver ran down my spine as I met her gaze. "Lost, are you?" she rasped, her voice a low croak that seemed to echo through the woods. No one dared to answer. We were frozen, trapped in the spell of her presence. "This forest is old," she continued, her voice barely a whisper now, older than you can imagine. "It holds secrets, dangers, things that should not be disturbed." Her words hung in the air, heavy with warning. We exchanged uneasy glances, each of us wondering what this strange woman was trying to tell us. "Beware the shadows," she whispered, her eyes fixed on something beyond us, something we couldn't see. "Beware the creatures that lurk in the darkness." They hunger for your fear, your despair. Her words sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I glanced nervously at the woods, imagining the figure we had seen earlier, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, the woman was gone. She vanished into the shadows, leaving us alone with our fear and her cryptic warning. The woman's words echoed in my mind, a chilling prophecy hanging over us. Beware the creatures that lurk in the darkness. What creatures? The figure in the woods? Was there more than one? A wave of nausea washed over me, and I realized it wasn't just fear I was feeling. There was something else, something primal and unsettling, coiling in my gut. I glanced at my friends, and my blood ran cold. Chris, always the picture of health, was pale and sweating, his eyes glazed over. He swayed on his feet, his breathing ragged and shallow. "Chris, what's wrong?" Emily asked, her voice laced with concern. He didn't answer. He just stared at us, his eyes wide and unseeing. Then, a low growl rumbled from his throat, a sound that was both familiar and utterly alien. "Chris?" Jake stepped closer, his hand outstretched. "Dude, are you all right?" But Chris didn't seem to hear him. He took a step back, his body tensing, his muscles rippling beneath his skin. His eyes, once warm and brown, now glowed with a sickly yellow light. His teeth elongated, his fingernails thickened and sharpened into claws. A low snarl ripped from his throat, and the horrifying truth dawned on us. Chris was transforming. Right before our eyes, he was becoming something monstrous, something inhuman. The werewolf from Old Man Fitz's stories. The creature that lurked in the shadows, hungry for fear and despair. The transformation was complete. Chris, our friend, was gone, replaced by a snarling beast with glowing yellow eyes and razor-sharp teeth. The shock and disbelief that had held us captive shattered, replaced by primal fear. The werewolf lunged. Emily screamed, a high-pitched sound that was cut short as the creature slammed her against the tree trunk. Jake reacted instantly, grabbing a burning log from the fire and swinging it at the beast. The werewolf howled in pain, the flames licking at its fur. I scrambled back, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. This was a nightmare, a twisted hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But the sharp scent of blood and the agonizing cries of my friends were all too real. Jake fought with a ferocity I'd never seen in him before, but he was no match for the creature's strength and speed. The werewolf swatted the burning log aside, sending sparks flying, and lunged at Jake, its claws tearing into his flesh. I knew I had to do something, anything. Grabbing a heavy branch from the ground, I charged at the werewolf, screaming with a mixture of fear and rage. I swung the branch with all my might, connecting with the creature's head with a sickening thud. The werewolf staggered back, momentarily stunned. Jake, bleeding and dazed, scrambled away. I pressed my attack, swinging the branch again and again, each blow fueled by desperation and adrenaline. Finally, with a whimper, the werewolf turned and fled into the darkness. We were left in the flickering firelight, surrounded by the sounds of our ragged breathing and the cries of our injured friend. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the rain, still falling relentlessly, and the ragged gasps of our own breathing. Emily lay motionless against the tree, her eyes closed, blood staining her clothes. Jake was slumped against a rock, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to get help." Jake nodded, his eyes filled with fear and pain. "Emily," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. We rushed to her side, our hearts pounding with dread. She was breathing, but shallowly. Her eyes fluttered open, and a weak smile touched her lips. "Don't worry about me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just get out of here." We knew we couldn't stay. The werewolf was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and we were in no condition to fight. With heavy hearts, we helped Emily to her feet, supporting her between us as we stumbled away from the campsite. The journey through the rain-soaked woods was agonizing. Every step sent jolts of pain through Emily, and Jake's strength was fading fast. The darkness seemed to press in on us, the shadows alive with unseen threats. We were lost, injured, and hunted. But we had to keep moving. We had to reach the road, find help, escape this nightmare. With each painful step, we clung to that hope, that sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness. And then we saw it. A pair of eyes, glowing yellow in the distance, watching us from the shadows. The Skinwalker. It had been following us, waiting for us to falter, to succumb to our fear and exhaustion. We pressed on, our pace quickening despite the pain. The eyes followed us, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond our vision. But we refused to give in. We would not become victims of this creature, of this cursed forest. The rain finally began to ease as we stumbled out of the woods, the tree-line giving way to the blessed sight of asphalt. The road stretched out before us, a ribbon of hope in the desolate landscape. We collapsed onto the muddy verge, our bodies spent, our spirits broken. Headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the gloom like a beacon. We waved our arms frantically, shouting for help, our voices hoarse and raw. The car slowed, its headlights illuminating our battered and terrified faces. The driver, a middle-aged man with wary eyes, rolled down his window. "What happened to you folks?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. We tried to explain, our words tumbling over each other in a desperate torrent. The werewolf, the witch, the skinwalker, the symbols carved into the tree. But our stories sounded wild, unbelievable even to our own ears. The driver's expression hardened. "You kids been drinking?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "No," I insisted. "We're telling the truth. Please, you have to believe us." He hesitated, his gaze flickering between our faces and the dark woods behind us. Finally, with a sigh, he unlocked the car doors. "Get in," he said gruffly. "I'll take you to the nearest town." We piled into the back seat, our bodies aching, our minds still reeling from the horrors we had witnessed. As the car pulled away from the forest, I glanced back at the tree-line, half expecting to see the glowing eyes of the skinwalker watching us. But there was nothing there. Just the dark, silent woods, shrouded in mist and rain. The warmth of the car heater did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within my bones. We sat in the back, huddled together, our silence punctuated only by the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers and the occasional sniffle from Emily. The driver, a man named John, had offered us blankets and hot coffee, his initial skepticism replaced by a hesitant concern. He didn't press us for details, sensing that we were still too shaken to recount the full horror of our experience. As the town lights flickered into view, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. We were safe now, at least for the moment. But the events of the night replayed in my mind a relentless loop of fear and despair. The witch's warning, the transformation, the desperate fight for survival, the chilling pursuit through the woods. And the Skinwalker, always watching, always lurking just beyond the reach of the light. Were we truly safe? Or had we brought something back with us from the forest, something that would haunt us forever? John dropped us off at the local hospital, where we were treated for our injuries and questioned by the police. Our story was met with disbelief, as we expected. But there were traces of doubt in their eyes, a flicker of unease that mirrored our own. They promised to investigate, to send someone out to the campsite. But we knew they wouldn't find anything. The forest would keep its secrets, as it always had. As I lay in the hospital bed, staring at the sterile white ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't over. The Skinwalker's eyes, glowing in the darkness, haunted my thoughts. What did it want? Why had it spared us? And what about Chris? Was he still out there, lost in the woods, a prisoner of his own monstrous transformation? The questions lingered, unanswered, a heavy weight on my soul. We had survived the night, but at what cost? The scars of our experience ran deep, both physical and emotional. And the fear, the primal, gnawing fear, remained. We had escaped the forest, but the forest had not escaped us. It would forever be a part of us, a dark shadow lurking in the depths of our memories, a constant reminder of the horrors that lie hidden just beyond the edge of the light. So, it was supposed to be just a regular camping trip. You know, the kind where you get away from the city, breathe some fresh air, and maybe have a beer or two around a campfire. Alex, my buddy since forever, had this crazy idea to head out to the Black Hills National Forest. Jess, his girlfriend, was all for it, and Ben, well, Ben just goes along with whatever Alex says. And me? I wasn't gonna be the one to back out. Besides, I needed a break from work and from everything, really. We spent weeks planning the whole thing. Alex, being the organized one, made a list of everything we needed: tents, sleeping bags, those headlamps that make you look like a coal miner, enough food to feed a small army. You name it, we had it. I even threw in a few extra packs of those fire starters, just in case. You never know when you're gonna need a good fire, right? As the day of the trip got closer, I started getting this weird feeling in my gut. Like something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was there, this nagging sense of unease. I almost bailed, I swear. But then I thought, come on, man, don't be a wimp. It's just a camping trip. So I pushed those thoughts aside, packed my bag, and told myself it was gonna be fine. We all met up at Alex's place early Saturday morning, the car packed to the brim with gear. Jess was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement, and even Ben cracked a smile. Alex, ever the leader, gave us a rundown of the plan, pointing to a map he'd printed out. "All right, team," he said, "we're heading deep into the Black Hills. No cell service, no civilization, just us and the wilderness. Sounds good, right?" We all nodded, trying to match his enthusiasm. But that feeling in my gut, it was still there. And it was getting stronger. The drive was brutal. I mean, seriously, it felt like we were driving forever. We left the highway miles back, and now it was just these narrow, winding roads through the middle of nowhere. Thick forests on both sides, the kind that make you feel like something's watching you from between the trees. Jess, bless her heart, tried to keep the mood light, putting on some cheesy pop music. But even her bubbly personality couldn't quite cut through the tension that was starting to build. The further we drove, the more desolate it got. No more gas stations, no little towns, not even a stray house. Just miles and miles of trees, getting thicker and darker with every turn. The sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long, creepy shadows across the road. I swear, I kept seeing things move in the corner of my eye, but when I looked, there was nothing there. At one point, we passed this old, weather-beaten sign. It had a picture of a deer on it, and some warnings about wildlife. But underneath, someone had scrawled something in red spray paint. It said, "Beware the Skinwalkers." I remember thinking it was some kind of joke, some local legend or something. But it still sent a shiver down my spine. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the trailhead. It was just a small dirt clearing, barely big enough for our car. The woods pressed in on all sides, dark and silent. The only sound was the wind whispering through the trees, and it sounded like someone sighing. We all got out of the car, stretching our legs and taking in the scenery. But the excitement from earlier was gone, replaced by this heavy, oppressive feeling, like we were being watched. I remember looking back at the road, thinking about just turning around and going home. But Alex was already unloading the gear, and Jess was practically dragging Ben towards the trail. So, I took a deep breath, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and followed them into the woods. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. It was that kind of smell that gets into your clothes and hair and stays with you for days. We trudged through the undergrowth, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and I kept tripping over roots and rocks. I was already sweating, and we hadn't even reached the campsite yet. Alex, ever the Eagle Scout, had picked out a spot on his map, a small clearing about a mile from the trailhead. It was getting pretty dark by the time we got there, and we had to use our headlamps to see what we were doing. We got to work setting up the tents, fumbling with the poles and stakes in the dim light. I swear, I've never appreciated a good tent until that moment. The silence was eerie. Except for the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig, there was no sound. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath, watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Once the tents were up, We gathered some firewood. Dead branches were scattered everywhere, and it wasn't long before we had a decent pile. Alex got the fire going, and the flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. The warmth from the fire was a welcome relief, chasing away the chill that had settled into my bones. We huddled around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. Jess told a spooky story about a local legend, something about a creature that could shapeshift into any animal it wanted. I laughed it off, but I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The forest seemed to be closing in on us, the darkness pressing against the circle of firelight. As I stared into the flames, I noticed something strange. There were symbols carved into the bark of the trees surrounding the clearing. They were crude and abstract, like something a child might draw. I pointed them out to the others, but they didn't seem too concerned. Probably just some kids messing around, Alex said. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Something sinister. Nightfall in the Black Hills is something else, man. It's not like the city, where there's always some light pollution hanging around. Out there, it's pitch black. The kind of darkness that swallows you whole. The fire was our only source of light, the flames dancing and casting flickering shadows on the trees. We kept feeding it logs, not just for the warmth, but because somehow that fire felt like the only thing keeping us safe. We sat around the fire, talking and laughing, trying to keep our spirits up. But the stories and jokes started to dry up as the night wore on. The silence kept creeping in, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. Every little sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, made me jump. I kept scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, half expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. Then it happened. A howl, long and mournful, echoed through the forest. It started low, then rose to a chilling crescendo before fading away into the night. It sounded like nothing I'd ever heard before. My blood ran cold. What the hell was that? Jess whispered, her voice trembling. Probably just a coyote, Alex said, trying to sound calm. But I could see the fear in his eyes. Even Ben, who usually looked like he was half asleep, was sitting up straight, his eyes wide. We listened intently, but the owl didn't come again. Just the silence, heavy and oppressive. But the feeling of being watched, the feeling I had since we arrived, was now 100 times stronger. It was like something out there in the darkness was toying with us, letting us know it was there. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the spooky stories and the creepy sign had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something very wrong. We didn't get much sleep that night. Every little creak or groan from the forest sent our hearts racing. I think we were all secretly terrified that whatever made that owl would come back. I know I was. I lay awake in my tent, staring up at the thin nylon that separated me from the darkness, listening to every sound, every rustle, every snap. Just as the first hint of dawn started to paint the sky a pale gray, I finally drifted off. But it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I was plagued by nightmares, vivid and terrifying, of creatures with glowing eyes and sharp claws. I woke up with a gasp, my heart pounding in my chest. I unzipped the tent and crawled out, blinking in the morning light. The others were already awake, huddled around the remnants of the fire. They looked as exhausted and scared as I felt. "Did you guys hear that?" Jess asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Hear what?" I said, my stomach clenching. "There was something moving around in the bushes," she said, pointing towards the edge of the clearing. I saw its eyes. They were glowing. We all stared in the direction she was pointing, but there was nothing there. Just the thick undergrowth and the silent trees. "It's probably just a deer or something," Alex said, but his voice lacked conviction. We tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, but it lingered like a bad smell. We ate a quick breakfast of granola bars and trail mix, the food tasting like ash in my mouth. The plan was to hike to a nearby lake that Alex had marked on his map. But none of us seemed eager to venture further into the woods. As we were packing up our gear, I heard it again. A rustling in the bushes, followed by the distinct sound of snapping branches. It was close, too close. "There!" Ben shouted, pointing towards the sound. We all spun around, our hearts pounding in our chests. And then we saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, peering at us from the shadows. They were yellow, like a cat's eyes, but much larger and filled with a malevolent intelligence that made my blood run cold. We froze, our breath caught in our throats. The creature remained hidden in the undergrowth, its eyes fixed on us. Then, with a suddenness that made us jump, it turned and disappeared into the dense foliage. We stood there for a moment, our hearts still racing, our minds trying to process what we had just seen. Whatever it wasn't a deer. It was something else. Something far more sinister. "What the hell was that?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. None of us could answer. We all knew, deep down, that we had just encountered something truly terrifying. Something that we couldn't explain. The encounter with those glowing eyes shook us to the core. We decided to scrap the hike to the lake and just get the hell out of there. We quickly packed up our gear, throwing everything into our backpacks haphazardly. The sense of urgency was palpable. We had to get out of those woods, and fast. As we were dismantling the tents, I noticed something strange. The symbols carved into the trees, the ones I had seen the night before, seemed to have multiplied. There were more of them now, covering almost every tree in the clearing. And they were different, more intricate, almost like writing. I pointed it out to the others, and a wave of fear washed over their faces. We all felt it now, the undeniable presence of something evil lurking nearby. "We need to go, now," Jess said, her voice high-pitched with panic. We scrambled to our feet and hurried towards the trail, our backpacks bouncing against our backs. We didn't speak, just focused on putting as much distance between us and the clearing as possible. But as we made our way through the dense undergrowth, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see those glowing eyes watching us from the shadows. Then, we heard it. A guttural growl, low and menacing, coming from somewhere behind us. We froze, our blood turning to ice. The growl grew louder, closer. And then, We saw it. The creature emerged from the trees, its form shifting and changing before our very eyes. It was like something out of a nightmare, a grotesque mockery of nature. Its limbs were elongated and twisted, its fur matted and patchy. Its face was a horrifying blend of human and animal features, with a snarling mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. Those glowing yellow eyes, filled with a cold, predatory intelligence. They were the eyes of a hunter, relishing the fear in its prey. We knew then what we were dealing with. This wasn't just some wild animal. This was a skinwalker, a creature of pure evil, capable of assuming any form it desired. And it was hunting us. Panic seized us. We screamed and scrambled back, desperate to get away from that thing. It lunged, its claws raking the air, missing Jess by inches. She stumbled and fell, her face contorted in terror. Alex, bless his soul, reacted instantly. He shoved Jess out of the way and grabbed the hunting knife he always carried on his belt. He lunged at the skinwalker, the blade flashing in the dim light. The creature snarled, its teeth bared in a vicious grin. They grappled, Alex's grunts of exertion mixing with the creature's guttural growls. Ben and I just stood there, frozen in fear. We were useless, completely unprepared for this. I fumbled for my own pocket knife, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get it open. The skinwalker was incredibly strong. It tossed Alex aside like a rag doll, sending him crashing into a tree. He slumped to the ground, groaning in pain. The creature turned its attention to Jess, who was still struggling to get to her feet. "No!" I screamed, finally finding my voice. I charged at the skinwalker, my tiny knife held out in front of me like a pathetic shield. The creature turned its head, those glowing eyes fixing on me with chilling intensity. It snarled, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my very bones. I knew I didn't stand a chance. But just as it was about to pounce, a shot rang out. The skinwalker staggered back, a dark stain blooming on its chest. Ben, his face pale but determined, stood behind us, his grandfather's old rifle clutched in his hands. The creature howled in pain and rage, its eyes burning with hatred. It lunged at Ben, its claws outstretched. But Ben fired again, and the skinwalker stumbled, its movements becoming sluggish. We took that opportunity to run. We didn't look back, didn't stop until we were far away from that clearing, from that monster. We left Alex behind. I still have nightmares about the look in his eyes as we fled, a mixture of betrayal and despair. We were lost, alone, and hunted. And we knew, with a chilling certainty, that the skinwalker wasn't finished with us yet. We ran blindly, our lungs burning, our legs screaming for rest. But we couldn't stop. We knew that thing was still after us, its howls echoing through the trees, getting closer with every passing second. The forest was a maze, branches whipping in our faces, thorns tearing at our clothes. We stumbled over roots, fell into ditches, scrambled back up, and kept running. The darkness was our only ally, concealing us from the creature's sight. But it also made it impossible to see where we were going. We were separated now, scattered through the woods like leaves in a storm. I lost sight of Jess and Ben somewhere in the chaos. I called out their names, but my voice was swallowed by the sounds of the forest. The only response was the Skinwalker's chilling howls, getting closer and closer. I tripped and fell, my ankle twisting beneath me. Pain shot through my leg, and I cried out. I tried to get up, but the pain was too intense. I lay there, helpless, listening to the creature's approach. It was close now. I could hear its ragged breathing, its claws scraping against the bark of the trees. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But then, silence. I opened my eyes cautiously, scanning the darkness. There was nothing there. Had it gone? Had I somehow managed to escape? I slowly got to my feet, my ankle throbbing. I limped forward, desperate to find Jess and Ben, to make sure they were okay. But as I moved through the trees, I noticed something strange. The symbols, those damn symbols, were everywhere. Carved into the trees, etched into the rocks, even painted on the leaves. They seemed to be guiding me, leading me deeper into the forest. I didn't know what to do. Should I follow them? Or try to find my way back to the trail? I was lost, alone, and terrified. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay there. The Skinwalker was still out there, and it wouldn't give up until it had caught us. My ankle was throbbing, a constant reminder of my vulnerability. But I couldn't stop. I had to find Jess and Ben, had to make sure they were still alive. The symbols, those damn symbols, continued to guide me through the darkness. I didn't trust them, but I had no other choice. They were the only path I had. The forest seemed to be closing in on me, the trees growing taller and denser, the darkness more oppressive. The air was thick with a strange, musky scent, like rotting flesh and damp earth. I gagged, but pressed on. Then, I saw it. A faint glow in the distance, flickering like a dying ember. I stumbled towards it, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. As I got closer, the glow grew brighter, revealing a clearing bathed in an eerie light. And in the center of the clearing, I saw them. Jess and Ben, huddled together, their faces pale and drawn. They were surrounded by those symbols, now glowing with an otherworldly light. And then I saw it. The Skinwalker. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its form shifting and changing, its eyes burning with malevolent glee. It was toying with them, herding them towards some unknown fate. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and watch them die. But what could I do? I was just one person, armed with nothing but a useless pocket knife. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I had to think, had to come up with a plan. But my mind was blank, paralyzed by fear. Then I saw it. A rock, large and jagged, lying at the edge of the clearing. It was my only chance. I limped towards the rock, keeping low to the ground. The Skinwalker didn't seem to notice me, its attention focused on Jess and Ben. I reached the rock and hefted it in my hands. It was heavy, but I managed to lift it. I took aim, my arms shaking with exertion. And then, I threw it. The rock sailed through the air, arcing towards the Skinwalker. It struck the creature in the head with a sickening thud. The Skinwalker roared in pain and fury, its eyes blazing. It turned towards me, its claws outstretched. I braced myself for the attack, knowing this was the end. But then, something incredible happened. A blinding light erupted from the forest, engulfing the clearing in a white-hot blaze. I shielded my eyes, blinded by the intensity. When I could see again, the Skinwalker was gone, vanished without a trace. Jess and Ben were staring at me, their eyes wide with disbelief. We were alive. We had survived. The light faded, leaving us blinking in the sudden darkness. The clearing was silent, the only sound the pounding of our hearts. We stood there for a moment, just breathing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. What was that? Jess stammered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to answer. I didn't know what it was, some kind of force. Energy? Whatever it was, it had saved us. We stumbled out of the clearing, our legs shaky, our bodies exhausted. We didn't speak much, just kept moving, driven by the primal need to get as far away from that place as possible. We finally reached the trailhead just as the first rays of dawn were breaking. We collapsed on the ground, our bodies spent, our minds reeling. A park ranger found us a few hours later. He called for an ambulance, and we were taken to the nearest hospital. They checked us over, treated our injuries, asked us a lot of questions we couldn't answer. They seemed to think we were just delirious, suffering from exposure and dehydration. We never told them the truth. Who would believe us? A story about a shape-shifting creature, glowing symbols, and a blinding light? They'd lock us up in the loony bin for sure. We were discharged a few days later, battered and bruised, but alive. We went back to our lives, trying to pretend that nothing had happened. But it wasn't that easy. The nightmares haunted us, vivid and terrifying. The feeling of being watched never left us. We knew, deep down, that the Skinwalker was still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness, waiting for its next victims. We never went camping again. The woods hold a different kind of fear for us now, a darkness we can never escape. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I see those glowing eyes in the shadows, watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I know it's out there. And I know it's not finished with us yet. The rain was relentless. It wasn't a downpour, more like a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into your bones. It had been falling since we left the city, coating the windows of the SUV in a sheet of wire that the wipers struggled to clear. The further we drove, the denser the forest became, the trees crowding the roadside like silent, watchful giants. "Are you sure this is the right way, Mark?" Emily asked, her voice tight with apprehension. Mark, ever the confident one, just chuckled and patted the steering wheel. "Relax, Em. I've been coming to this campsite since I was a kid. It's the perfect spot, trust me." I wasn't so sure. There was something about the place that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the oppressive silence of the woods, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the wipers and the occasional crackle of the radio. Or maybe it was the way the fog clung to the ground, obscuring the trees in a ghostly shroud. Whatever it was, a sense of foreboding had settled over me, heavy and suffocating. We finally arrived at the campsite as dusk began to settle. It was a small clearing, nestled deep within the woods. The rain had turned the ground into a muddy swamp, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. We quickly set up our tents, the urgency fueled by the encroaching darkness and the persistent drizzle. As night fell, we huddled around a crackling campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. The warmth of the fire did little to dispel the chill that had seeped into my bones. We shared stories and laughter, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that we were being watched. Suddenly, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the firelight. We all fell silent, straining our ears for any further sound. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the pounding of my own heart. Probably just an animal, Mark said, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. But I could see the unease in his eyes, mirroring my own. We tried to return to our conversation, but the moment had been broken. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. The fire crackled and hissed, spitting embers into the damp night air. We sat huddled around it, our faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The unsettling feeling from earlier hadn't dissipated, and a palpable tension hung in the air. Maybe we should try the radio again, Sarah suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark reached into the SUV and fiddled with the dial, but only static met our ears. The silence that followed was deafening, amplifying every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. The feeling of being watched intensified, prickling my skin. I scanned the perimeter of the firelight, my eyes straining to pierce the darkness beyond. The trees swayed ominously in the wind, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her eyes white with fear. We all held our breath, listening intently. A faint whisper seemed to drift through the trees, carried on the wind. It was a low, guttural sound, like a voice gargling with gravel. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "It's just the wind," Mark said, his voice strained. But even as he spoke, I could see doubt etched on his face. The whispering grew louder, closer. It seemed to be circling us, closing in. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Then, a shadow moved at the edge of the firelight. It was a tall, slender figure, hunched over and shrouded in darkness. We all stared at it, our hearts pounding in our chests. "Who is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. We looked at each other, but no one answered. None of us recognized the figure. It remained motionless, its form barely discernible in the dim light. As we watched, the figure slowly began to straighten up. It was then that I noticed it. The figure had no head. The fire roared, a defiant blaze against the encroaching darkness, yet its light only served to amplify the horror before us. The figure stood motionless, its headless form casting a long, distorted shadow that danced and writhed in the flickering firelight. Where the head should have been, there was nothing. Just a smooth, rounded stump, glistening in the rain. The sight was so unnatural, so utterly wrong, that my mind struggled to comprehend it. "Oh my God," Emily breathed, her voice a strangled whisper. Mark, ever the pragmatist, even in the face of the impossible, stammered, "It's some kind of trick, right? A prank?" But even as he spoke, the words rang hollow. There was no mirth in this, no hint of a hidden camera or a costumed friend jumping out for a laugh. This was something else, something ancient and malevolent. The figure remained still, but its presence seemed to grow, filling the clearing with an oppressive weight. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. The whispering returned, louder now, swirling around us like a vortex of despair. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the figure raised its arm. It pointed a skeletal finger directly at me. A jolt of terror surged through me, icy and paralyzing. I felt like a rabbit caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck, frozen in place, unable to move or even scream. The figure began to move towards us, its steps silent and gliding, as if it were floating across the ground. With each step, the whispering intensified, the voices growing louder, more desperate, more filled with malice. We scrambled back from the fire, our eyes fixed on the approaching figure. Fear gripped us, primal and overwhelming. We were trapped, cornered by the unknown, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The figure lurched forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was like a puppet with its strings cut, animated by some unseen, malevolent force. The whispering reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices screaming in my ears. "Run!" Mark yelled, breaking the spell of terror that had held us captive. We scrambled to our feet, scattering in different directions. I stumbled over a tree root, falling face first into the mud. The cold, wet earth slapped against my skin, bringing me back to my senses. I scrambled up, my heart pounding like a drum. The figure was still coming, its headless form silhouetted against the firelight. It seemed to glide across the uneven ground, its movements eerily smooth. I ran blindly, crashing through the undergrowth, the branches whipping at my face and arms. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking me to the bone. I could hear my friends screaming in the distance, their voices swallowed by the storm. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I had to get away from that thing. The image of its headless form, the smooth, rounded stump where its head should have been, was burned into my mind. I burst out of the trees and onto a narrow dirt road. I didn't recognize it. We must have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Headlights appeared in the distance, growing larger with every passing second. A car. Salvation. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The car slowed, then came to a stop beside me. I flung open the door and tumbled inside, gasping for breath. Drive. Just drive. I yelled at the driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a worried expression. She didn't hesitate. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, and the car roared back to life, speeding away from the campsite and the horror that lurked within. As we drove, I glanced back at the dark, rain-soaked forest, half expecting to see the headless figure emerge from the trees, pursuing us relentlessly. But there was nothing there. Just the endless rows of trees, swaying in the wind, and the sound of the rain pounding against the car windows. But even though I had escaped, I knew that the terror wasn't over. The image of the headless figure, the feeling of its presence, the sound of the whispering voices, they would haunt me forever. The woman, bless her soul, didn't ask any questions. She just kept driving, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. The rain was still coming down in sheets, and the windshield wipers worked furiously to keep the road visible. "Thank you," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "Thank you for stopping." She gave me a small, reassuring smile. "Of course. Are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed. If only she knew. I had a bit of a scare back there. My friends and I, we were camping, and I trailed off, unsure how to explain what we had seen. How could I possibly describe the headless figure, the whispering voices, the sheer terror that had gripped us? "It's okay," the woman said gently. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. Just try to relax. You're safe now." I nodded, leaning back against the seat and closing my eyes. But the image of the headless figure still lingered in my mind, and the whispering voices echoed in my ears. We drove in silence for what felt like hours. The rain finally began to let up, and the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of the moon. I looked out the window and realized we were in the middle of nowhere. There were no houses, no streetlights, just endless fields stretching out into the darkness. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice hoarse. The woman sighed. "I'm not sure. I took a few wrong turns back there. I'm trying to get back to the main road." She pulled out her phone and checked the map. "It looks like we're still a few miles out. But there's a small town just up ahead. We can stop there and get our bearings." I nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe this nightmare was finally over. Maybe I could get back to my friends, back to safety. But as we approached the town, a sense of unease crept over me. The town was small, almost deserted. The few houses we passed were dark and dilapidated. The streets were empty, and an eerie silence hung in the air. The woman slowed the car, her brow furrowed. "This place, it feels strange." I nodded, my heart sinking. I had a bad feeling about this. A very bad feeling. As we drove through the deserted streets, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. A figure was standing at the edge of town, watching us. It was tall and slender, shrouded in shadow. And it had no head. A wave of nausea washed over me. It couldn't be. It was impossible. We had driven miles away from that cursed campsite. How could it be here? The woman saw it too. Her eyes widened in fear, and she gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was constricted with fear. The figure was getting closer, its long strides eating up the distance between us. It moved with an unnatural grace, its headless form gliding across the deserted streets. The woman slammed her foot on the accelerator, and the car lurched forward. We sped through the town, the houses blurring past in a dizzying rush. But the figure kept pace, its long legs carrying it effortlessly. We reached the edge of town, but there was no escape. The road ended abruptly at a dense thicket of trees. The woman slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt. "We're trapped," she cried, her voice filled with despair. I looked back at the figure. It was almost upon us, its headless form looming over the car like a specter of death. The whispering voices were back, louder than ever, filling the air with their chilling cries. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and wait to die. "Get out of the car," I yelled at the woman. She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to run for it," I said. "It's our only chance." She nodded, and we scrambled out of the car. We plunged into the woods, the branches scratching in our faces and arms. The rain had started again, and the ground was slick with mud. We ran blindly, our lungs burning, our legs aching. But the figure was faster. It glided through the trees, its headless form barely visible in the darkness. We could hear it behind us, its footsteps soft but relentless. The whispering voices grew louder, urging it on. I glanced back over my shoulder. The figure was gaining on us. Its long, skeletal fingers reached out, grasping for us. We stumbled and fell, our bodies hitting the wet ground with a thud. We scrambled to our feet, but it was too late. The figure was upon us. The figure towered over us, its form a grotesque silhouette against the moonlit sky. The whispering voices reached a crescendo, a chorus of screams and wails that seemed to tear at my sanity. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. But the blow never came. Instead, I heard a gasp, a choked cry of terror. I opened my eyes to see the woman standing frozen, her eyes fixed on something behind me. "What?" I began, but the words caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head. Standing behind the headless figure, bathed in the pale moonlight, was another figure. This one was taller, broader, and radiating an aura of power that made my blood run cold. It wore a long, hooded cloak that obscured its face in shadow, but I could see its hands, skeletal, gnarled, and tipped with claws that glinted like obsidian. The headless figure seemed to shrink back, its whispering entourage falling silent. It was as if even this creature of darkness was afraid of the newcomer. The hooded figure raised its hand, and a bolt of energy shot out, striking the headless figure in the chest. The figure let out a silent scream, its form dissolving into a cloud of black smoke that dissipated into the night. I stared in disbelief. What was happening? Who was this new figure? Was it friend or foe? The hooded figure turned towards us, its face still hidden in shadow. I felt a tremor of fear run through me. This being, whatever it was, possessed a power that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. It took a step towards us, and I instinctively reached out to grab the woman's hand. We huddled together, two terrified creatures caught in the gaze of something ancient and unknowable. The figure stopped in front of us, its presence filling the clearing like a suffocating blanket. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin prickle. Then, slowly, the figure raised its hand. It reached out towards me, its clawed fingers inches from my face. I closed my eyes, waiting for the touch, the judgment, the end. But the touch never came. Instead, I heard a voice, deep and resonant, echoing through the woods. "You are not meant to be here," the voice said, its tone both chilling and strangely comforting. "This is not your fight." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hooded figure vanished. The clearing was silent once more, the only sound the gentle patter of rain on the leaves. We were alone. The woman and I stumbled back to the car, our bodies trembling, our minds reeling from the encounter. We didn't speak, couldn't speak. The events of the past few hours had shaken us to our core. We drove in silence, the only sound the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers and the occasional sob escaping the woman's lips. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy in the sky, casting a pall over the landscape. As dawn approached, we finally reached the main road. The sight of other cars, of signs of civilization, filled me with a sense of relief that I hadn't realized I was craving. We stopped at a gas station, a beacon of normalcy in the vast expanse of darkness. The woman insisted on buying me a coffee and some food, her kindness a balm to my frayed nerves. I don't know how to thank you," I said, my voice cracking. She smiled sadly. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just glad you're okay." We exchanged numbers, promising to stay in touch, to check in on each other. Then, with a final wave goodbye, I watched her drive away, disappearing into the morning mist. I stood there for a long time, watching the cars go by, feeling the warmth of the rising sun on my face. I was alive. I had survived. But the memories of the night, the terror, the encounter with the headless figure and the hooded being would stay with me forever. I eventually managed to hitch a ride back to the campsite. The clearing was deserted. The tents were still there, rain-soaked and abandoned. The remnants of the campfire lay cold and lifeless. There was no sign of my friends. A wave of guilt washed over me. Had they escaped? Were they still lost in the woods, hunted by the headless figure? Or had they met a worse fate? I didn't know. And I didn't know if I ever would. I left the campsite, leaving behind the horror, the unanswered questions, the ghosts of my friends. I walked away, carrying the weight of the night on my shoulders, a burden I would carry for the rest of my life. The Navajo Reservation stretches out like an endless, sun-baked ocean, the mesas rising up like jagged waves in the distance. It's a place where the earth feels ancient, where the wind whispers secrets in a language I don't understand, even though I've lived here my whole life. My name's Jake, and I'm 20 years old. Grew up in a small town on the reservation, a place where everyone knows everyone, and gossip travels faster than a dust devil. Life here is slow, quiet. Most folks think it's boring, but I never minded. I like the peace, the way the stars blaze at night like someone spilled a whole box of glitter across the sky. But lately, things haven't felt so peaceful. There's a tension hanging in the air, thick and heavy like the humidity before a summer storm. People are whispering about strange things happening out in the desert, things they can't explain. Old man Yazzie, who lives out near the canyon, claims he saw something moving out there in the twilight, something tall and lanky with eyes that burned like hot coals. Some folks say it's a coyote, others say a mountain lion, but old man Yazzie swears it was no animal he'd ever seen before. Then there's the Begay family, who lost a whole flock of sheep last week. Found them scattered across the mesa, torn apart like a kid's discarded toys. No tracks, no sign of any predator, just carnage. My grandma, she just shakes her head and mutters about the old ways, about things that go bump in the night. She's always been superstitious, but even I can't help but feel a shiver crawl down my spine when she talks like that. There's something out there in the vastness of the reservation, something ancient and hungry. I can feel it watching us, waiting for its moment to strike. The next few days were tense. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like I was being watched. The whispers about old man Yazzie's sighting and the Begay sheep had spread through the community like wildfire, and everyone was on edge. Even the dogs seemed spooked, whining and barking at shadows. One morning, I was helping my uncle fix a fence out by the grazing pasture. He's a man of few words, my uncle, but even he seemed preoccupied. "You hear about what happened to Ben Begay's truck?" he asked, squinting at the horizon. I shook my head. "What happened?" "Found it overturned down by the wash," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "No sign of Ben, though. Just his cell phone, lying cracked on the ground." A chill ran down my spine. Ben Begay was a tough guy, ex-military. What could have thrown him and his truck off the road like that? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the owls, every rustle of the wind outside, sent my heart racing. I kept replaying my uncle's words in my head, picturing Ben's overturned truck, the cracked cell phone. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. It was a low, guttural sound, like an animal in pain. I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then, I noticed a figure moving in the shadows at the edge of the tree. It was tall and lanky, and it moved with an unnatural fluidity. My breath caught in my throat. Was this what old man Yazzie had seen? The figure turned its head, and I saw its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. They were red, like burning coals. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just a coyote, or maybe a stray dog. But deep down, I knew it was something else. Something sinister. The next morning, I told my grandma about what I'd seen. She listened intently, her face etched with worry. "You need to be careful, Jake," she said. "There are things out there that we don't understand. Things that are best left alone." I nodded, trying to appear brave, but inside I was terrified. I knew that whatever was happening on the reservation, it was only going to get worse. A few nights later, I was driving back from a party at my cousin's place. It was late, maybe 2 a.m., and the road stretched out in front of me like a black ribbon. The only sound, the hum of my truck's engine and the occasional lonely howl of a coyote. I was tired, a little buzzed from the few beers I'd had, and all I could think about was getting home and crashing into bed. Then I saw it. A figure darted across the road in front of me. It was tall and slender, almost skeletal, and it moved with an uncanny speed and agility. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the loose gravel. My heart leaped into my throat. What the hell was that? I squinted into the darkness, trying to get a better look. The figure was gone. Vanished. I told myself it was just a deer, or maybe a coyote playing tricks on my tired eyes. But deep down, a cold dread was settling in my stomach. It had been too fast, too deliberate. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I put the truck in drive and slowly continued down the road, my eyes scanning the darkness. The hair on the back of my neck was standing on end. I felt like I was being watched. Suddenly, I saw it again. The figure was standing at the side of the road, just beyond the reach of my headlights. It was staring at me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. They were red, like burning embers. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my body going into fight or flight mode. I floored the gas pedal, the truck roaring forward. I didn't look back. I didn't stop driving until I reached the outskirts of town. I pulled over, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that it was just a trick of the light or a hallucination brought on by fatigue and alcohol. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something truly terrifying, something that defied explanation. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of the red eyes burned into my mind. I knew then that something was very wrong. Something dark and dangerous was lurking on the reservation, and it was watching me. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The encounter on the road kept replaying in my mind, every detail vivid and terrifying. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I had seen something real, something that defied explanation. I went about my day in a daze, trying to focus on work but finding it impossible to concentrate. Every time I was alone, even for a moment, the fear would creep back in. I felt like I was being watched, followed. The feeling was so intense that I started checking over my shoulder constantly, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. I tried to talk to my friends about what I had seen, but they just laughed it off. "You're just spooked, Jake," they said. It was probably just a coyote or something. I wanted to believe them, I really did. But the memory of those red eyes, the unnatural speed and agility of the figure, haunted me. I knew it wasn't just a coyote. It was something else, something far more sinister. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, tossing and turning, my mind racing. I thought about all the strange occurrences that had been happening on the reservation, the missing livestock, the overturned truck, the stories of people disappearing. Was it all connected? Was there some kind of predator stalking the reservation, preying on the vulnerable? The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I was in danger. I felt like I was a target, that whatever I had seen on the road was now hunting me. The fear was paralyzing. I wanted to tell someone, to ask for help, but I was afraid of being ridiculed, of being dismissed as crazy. So I kept it all bottled up inside, the anxiety growing with each passing day. The next few weeks were a blur of fear and paranoia. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, hunted. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger. Every creak of the house sent shivers down my spine. I started carrying a knife with me everywhere I went, even just to go to the bathroom. The strange occurrences on the reservation continued to escalate. More livestock went missing, their carcasses found mutilated and scattered across the fields. People started whispering about disappearances, about strange lights seen in the night sky. The atmosphere on the reservation was thick with fear and suspicion. One night, I woke up from a nightmare, my heart pounding in my chest. I had dreamt of the figure on the road, its red eyes burning into me. I sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I felt a presence in the room, a cold, malevolent energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I got out of bed and crept to the window. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the landscape in an eerie darkness. I scanned the shadows, my eyes searching for any sign of movement. Suddenly, I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the tree line, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was the same figure I had seen on the road, the same tall, slender form, the same burning red eyes. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew then that I wasn't imagining things. Whatever it was real, and it was after me. The next day, I went to see my grandmother. I told her about the nightmare, about the figure in the shadows. She listened patiently, her face etched with concern. "You need to be careful, Jake," she said. "There are things out there that we don't understand. Things that are best left alone." I nodded, trying to appear brave, but inside I was terrified. I knew that I was in over my head, that I needed help. But who could I turn to? Who would believe me? Grandma's words echoed in my head long after I left her house. Things we don't understand. What did she mean? Was she just being superstitious, or did she know something I didn't? I needed answers, and I knew there was only one person who could give them to me, my grandfather. Grandpa Jones was a respected elder in the community, a man of few words but immense wisdom. He was also a traditionalist, deeply connected to the old ways of the Navajo people. I hadn't spoken to him about the strange occurrences, hesitant to sound like I was losing it. But now, desperation was pushing me past my reluctance. I found him sitting on his porch, his weathered face etched with the lines of a life lived close to the land. He looked up as I approached, his eyes, the same deep brown as mine, filled with a quiet understanding. "You look troubled, grandson," he said, his voice rough but gentle. I hesitated, unsure how to begin. "Grandpa," I started, "there's something I need to tell you." I poured out the whole story, the encounter on the road, the nightmares, the growing sense of dread. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "What you have seen, Jake," he finally said, "is not something to be taken lightly." My heart sank. So it wasn't just my imagination. "What is it, Grandpa?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He sighed. "There are things in this world, Jake, that we do not fully understand. Things that exist in the shadows, on the edges of our perception. Things that are best left undisturbed." "But what is it?" I pressed. "What's happening on the reservation?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't comprehend. "There are stories, old stories, about creatures that walk the land in the skins of men. Creatures that prey on the weak, the vulnerable. Creatures that are drawn to fear and despair." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You mean, like He nodded slowly. "A skinwalker." The word hung in the air, heavy with dread. I had heard whispers of skinwalkers before, stories told around campfires to scare children, but I had never truly believed in them. Now, faced with the reality of my own experiences, I couldn't deny their existence any longer. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Grandpa reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He opened it and took out a turquoise pendant, intricately carved with ancient symbols. He placed it in my hand. "This will protect you," he said. "Wear it always, and never take it off." He then taught me a traditional Navajo prayer, a chant to ward off evil spirits. He told me to repeat it every night before I went to sleep, and to keep my mind strong. As I left his house, the pendant clutched tightly in my hand, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. Grandpa's words and the turquoise pendant gave me a sliver of comfort, a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. But the fear was still there, gnawing at me like a hungry animal. I knew I couldn't just sit around and wait for whatever was out there to come for me. I had to do something. I started by talking to some of the other guys on the reservation, guys I trusted, guys who knew the land and the old ways. At first, they were skeptical, but when I told them about my encounter on the road, about the figure with the red eyes, their expressions changed. They knew something was wrong, something that couldn't be explained away by logic or reason. We decided to take matters into our own hands. We gathered what weapons we could find, hunting rifles, shotguns, even a few old bows and arrows. We met late at night, under the cover of darkness, our faces grim, our hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. We headed out into the fastness of the reservation, following the trails and dirt roads that crisscrossed the land. We were looking for any sign of the creature, any clue that might lead us to its lair. The night was silent, the only sounds the crunch of our boots on the gravel and the occasional rustle of the wind through the dry brush. We searched for hours, our nerves on edge, our senses heightened. We scanned the shadows, listened for any unusual sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Finally, just as the first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the horizon, we found it. A small, isolated canyon hidden away from the main roads. As we approached, we noticed a faint, foul odor wafting from the canyon's depths, a smell of decay and death. We exchanged nervous glances, our hands tightening on our weapons. We knew we were close, that whatever was out there was waiting for us. We took a deep breath and entered the canyon, our flashlights illuminating the rocky walls and the dark, forbidding entrance to a cave. The feeling of dread was overwhelming. We knew we were walking into the unknown, into the heart of darkness. But we had come too far to turn back now. We had to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows, for our own sake, for the sake of the reservation. The cave mouth gaped before us like a maw, the darkness within seeming to swallow our flashlight beams. The stench of rot and decay was overpowering, stinging my nostrils and making my stomach churn. We hesitated at the entrance, fear battling with the grim determination that had brought us this far. "Ready?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. The others nodded, their faces pale in the dim light. We entered the cave single file, our flashlights cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something ancient and unsettling. The cave floor was uneven, strewn with rocks and debris. We moved cautiously, our senses on high alert. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the occasional drip of water from the cave ceiling. As we ventured deeper, the cave opened into a larger chamber. Our flashlights revealed a scene that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in crude drawings, disturbing depictions of human figures twisted into grotesque shapes. The floor was littered with bones, animal and human, some gnawed clean, others bearing the marks of teeth and claws. In the center of the chamber, a makeshift altar had been erected. It was a crude construction of stones and branches, upon which lay a collection of macabre offerings, animal skulls, feathers, and what appeared to be dried human organs. The sight was sickening, a testament to the depravity of whatever had created this lair. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. The others were equally disturbed, their faces pale and drawn. We had stumbled upon something truly evil, something that defied comprehension. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the chamber, a low growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The growl grew louder, closer, sending shivers down our spines. We knew then that we were not alone. Whatever had created this lair, whatever had performed these dark rituals, was still here, lurking in the shadows, watching us. The growl ripped through the silence again, closer this time, sending a jolt of fear through me. We tightened our grip on our weapons, our flashlights dancing nervously across the cave walls. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, playing tricks on our eyes. Then it lunged. A figure materialized from the darkness, a blur of motion that sent us scrambling back in panic. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs elongated and distorted, its eyes burning with a malevolent red light. It moved with an unnatural speed and agility, its movements fluid and predatory. A shot rang out, echoing through the chamber. One of the guys had fired his rifle, the bullet ricocheting off the cave wall with a deafening screech. The creature snarled, a guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. It lunged again, its claws outstretched, its eyes fixed on its prey. Chaos erupted. We fired our weapons blindly, the muzzle flashes illuminating the chamber in a strobe-like effect. The creature darted and weaved, dodging our attacks with an almost supernatural grace. It was like fighting a phantom, a creature that existed on the fringes of reality. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my fear giving way to a primal instinct for survival. I raised my own rifle and fired, the recoil jolting my shoulder. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the cave. It stumbled back, its movements momentarily faltering. We pressed our attack, our weapons blazing. The creature fought back with a ferocity that was terrifying, its claws raking the air, its teeth bared in a snarl. But we were too many, our firepower too overwhelming. The creature was wounded, its movements growing sluggish, its attacks less frequent. Finally, with a desperate lunge, it broke through our defenses and fled into the depths of the cave. We hesitated, unsure whether to pursue. But the creature was gone, vanished into the darkness. We were left standing in the chamber, our hearts pounding, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence that followed was deafening. We looked at each other, our faces pale and drawn, our eyes wide with fear and disbelief. We had survived, but at what cost? We had seen something that defied explanation, something that challenged our understanding of the world. And we knew that we would never be the same again. We stumbled out of the cave into the pale light of dawn, blinking against the sudden brightness. The fresh air hit us like a wave, washing away the stench of death and decay that had clung to us in the depths of the earth. We were alive, but we were different. We had seen something that had shaken us to our core, something that had challenged our understanding of the world. We returned to the reservation in silence, our minds reeling from the encounter. The news of our expedition spread quickly, and we were hailed as heroes. People thanked us for our bravery, for protecting the community from the unknown threat that had haunted their nights. But their gratitude felt hollow, their words empty. They didn't understand what we had seen, what we had experienced. They couldn't possibly comprehend the horror that lay hidden in the shadows of their world. In the days that followed, we tried to return to our normal lives, but it was impossible. The memories of the cave, the creature, the ambush, haunted our waking thoughts and invaded our dreams. We were jumpy, easily startled, our senses on high alert. The world seemed different now, darker, more sinister. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. I slept with a knife under my pillow, the turquoise pendant clutched tightly in my hand. The fear was still there, a constant companion that whispered doubts and anxieties in my ear. We never spoke of what we had seen, not to each other, not to anyone else. It was a shared trauma, a secret that bound us together in a way that no one else could understand. We were the guardians of a dark truth, the keepers of a terrifying knowledge. Life on the reservation gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but the sense of unease lingered. The whispers of strange occurrences continued, though they were fewer and farther between. The creature, whatever it was, had been wounded, driven back into the shadows. But it was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its moment to return. And we would be waiting for it, our hearts filled with a mixture of fear and grim determination. We were the protectors of the reservation, the guardians against the unknown. And we would not rest until the threat was eradicated, until the shadows were banished, and the land was safe once more. The drive up to Yosemite was killer. I mean, literally breathtaking. Emily kept gasping and pointing at every waterfall, every vista. Me, I was just trying not to drive off the damn cliffs. Those roads are windy. We've been planning this trip for months, a whole week of camping, hiking, getting away from it all. No phones, no emails, just us in the wilderness. Emily was all about finding herself or some crap like that. Me, I just needed to unplug before my head exploded from work stress. We finally rolled into our campsite, way out in the back country. It was pretty secluded, which was exactly what we wanted. No noisy neighbors, just the sounds of nature. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth, and the silence was almost deafening at first. After the city, it was kind of freaking me out. Setting up the tent was a whole ordeal. Turns out, neither of us was exactly Bear Grylls. We finally got it up, crooked as hell, but it would do. Emily, ever the optimist, declared it rustic charm. I declared it a good enough place to crash after we pound a few beers. As the sun started to set, the temperature dropped like a stone. We huddled around the campfire, the flames crackling and spitting, casting weird shadows on the trees around us. Emily was telling some story about her crazy coworker, but I wasn't really paying attention. I kept getting this prickling feeling on the back of my neck, like someone was watching us. I scanned the woods, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the deepening darkness. "You okay, dude?" Emily asked, snapping me out of it. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I laughed it off, told her I was just tired. But the truth was, I felt uneasy. Something just felt wrong. Like we weren't alone out there. Morning came, and the sunlight filtering through the trees made everything seem a little less menacing. Emily, bless her soul, was already up and making coffee. She was one of those annoyingly cheerful morning people. Me, I needed a gallon of coffee and a crowbar to pry my eyelids open. After choking down some breakfast, we decided to do a short hike to stretch our legs. There was a trailhead not far from our campsite that led to some scenic overlook. The trail was pretty well maintained, but it was definitely uphill. I was already sweating my ass off, but Emily was practically skipping along, humming some tuneless song. "Dude, chill," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. "We're not in a race." She just grinned and pointed ahead. "Almost there. I think I can see the view through the trees." A few minutes later, we emerged onto a rocky outcrop with a stunning panoramic view of the valley. We were so high up, it felt like we were on top of the world. The air was crisp and clean, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the pines. We spent a while just soaking it all in, taking pictures and just enjoying the peace and quiet. But as we were about to head back, I noticed something weird. Carved into the trunk of a nearby tree was a symbol, a circle with a line through it. It looked almost like, I don't know, some kind of ancient rune or something. "Hey, check this out," I said, pointing to the symbol. "What do you make of that?" She shrugged. "Probably just some kids messing around. Or maybe a park ranger marking the trail or something." I guess that made sense. but it still gave me the creeps. It just seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. We started heading back down the trail, and I tried to put the symbol out of my mind. But as we walked, I started noticing it everywhere. Carved into rocks, scratched into the bark of trees, even drawn in the dirt with a stick. It was like someone was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, leading us somewhere. By the time we got back to the campsite, I was seriously freaked out. I told Emily about seeing the symbol everywhere, but she just laughed it off. "You're seeing things, dude," she said. "It's just a coincidence." Maybe she was right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. And that symbol, it felt like a warning. The next day, we decided to tackle a longer hike. Emily had found this trail that led to a secluded waterfall, and she was determined to swim in it, no matter how freezing the water was. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the prospect of hypothermia, but hey, when you're with Emily, you just go with the flow. The trail was way more rugged than the one we'd taken the day before. We were scrambling over rocks, pushing through thick undergrowth, and swatting away mosquitoes the size of small birds. I was starting to regret not packing that machete I'd seen at the camping store. After a couple of hours, we finally reached the waterfall. It was pretty impressive, cascading down a moss-covered cliff into a crystal-clear pool. Emily, predictably, squealed with delight and immediately started stripping down to her swimsuit. Me, I just huddled in my jacket, shivering. "Come on, you wimp," she yelled, splashing in the water. "It's not that cold." "Yeah, right." I dipped a toe in, and it felt like sticking my foot in a bucket of ice water. No way was I getting in there. While Emily frolicked in the water like a polar bear cub, I decided to explore the area a bit. There was a small cave behind the waterfall, and I figured it might be worth checking out. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. There, on the wall of the cave, was that same symbol again. The circle with the line through it. This time, it was bigger, and it looked like it had been carved into the rock with some kind of tool. It was definitely not the work of some bored teenagers. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was getting weird. It was like that symbol was following us, taunting us. I backed away from the cave, feeling a growing sense of dread. When I got back to the pool, Emily was toweling off. I told her about the symbol in the cave, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Okay, that's kinda creepy," she admitted. "Maybe we should ask a ranger about it." I nodded. Yeah, maybe we should. But even as I said it, I knew we wouldn't. Something told me that this was something we needed to keep to ourselves. Something told me that asking questions might be dangerous. That night, I could barely sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the damn symbol burned into my brain. I kept replaying the day's events in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Was it some kind of prank? A weird local cult? Or was I just losing my mind? Emily seemed to be sleeping soundly, the lucky bastard. I envied her ability to just switch off her brain and drift off. Me, I was wide awake, listening to every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. The campfire had died down to embers, and the darkness outside the tent felt thick and oppressive. I could hear the usual night sounds, crickets chirping, and owl hooting in the distance, but there was something else too. A low, guttural growling that seemed to be coming from just beyond the edge of the firelight. I held my breath, straining to hear it again. There it was. A deep, rumbling growl, like some kind of animal, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It sent shivers down my spine. I nudged Emily awake. "Em, did you hear that?" I whispered. She mumbled something incoherent and rolled over. "Go back to sleep," she muttered. "No, seriously, listen," I insisted. We both lay there in silence for a moment, listening intently. The growling came again, closer this time. It was definitely an animal, but what kind of animal made a sound like that? Emily sat up, her eyes wide with fear. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know, but it doesn't sound good." We scrambled out of the tent, grabbing the flashlight. The growling was even louder now, and it seemed to be coming from the woods behind our campsite. We slowly crept towards the sound, our hearts pounding in our chests. The beam of the flashlight danced across the trees, but we couldn't see anything. The growling continued, getting louder and louder, until it felt like the creature was right on top of us. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We stood there for a long time, listening, but there was nothing. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice trembling. "Maybe it's gone." I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. Whatever the thing was, it was still out there, lurking in the darkness, watching us, waiting. The next morning, the sun seemed to have lost some of its power to reassure. The events of the night before hung over us like a dark cloud. Emily and I were both jumpy, every little sound sending us into a frenzy of paranoia. "Maybe we should just pack up and go," Emily suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to get the hell out of there, but another part of me was stubborn. I didn't want to let whatever was out there win. Besides, we'd driven for hours to get here, and I wasn't ready to give up on our vacation just yet. "Let's just stick to the main trails today," I said. "Stay in the open. We'll be fine." Famous last words, right? We decided to hike to Yosemite Falls, figuring that there would be plenty of other people around. Safety in numbers and all that. But even with the crowds, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned around, I expected to see someone or something lurking in the shadows. We stopped for lunch at a picnic area, and I swear I saw a figure darting between the trees. I pointed it out to Emily, but she just shook her head. "You're imagining things," she said. It was probably just a squirrel. Maybe she was right. But I couldn't help but feel like we were being stalked. Like something was toying with us, drawing us deeper into the woods. As we were hiking back, I noticed that the symbol had reappeared. It was carved into a rock beside the trail, almost as if it was placed there deliberately, just for us to see. I felt a surge of fear, cold and sharp, like a knife in my gut. That night, we built a bigger fire, hoping to keep whatever was out there at bay. But the fear was still there, gnawing at us. We huddled close to the flames, whispering nervously about what we should do. Maybe we should call a ranger, Emily said, her voice trembling. I nodded. Yeah, maybe we should. But even as I said it, I knew we wouldn't. We were too deep into this now. And something told me that calling for help might be the worst thing we could do. The next morning, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Emily was pale and quiet, and I knew she was just as scared as I was. We packed up our campsite in near silence, both of us eager to get away from that cursed place. As we were loading the car, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A flash of movement in the trees. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Did you see that? I whispered to Emily. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. See what? There, in the trees, I said, pointing. Something moved. We both stared into the woods, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the shadows. Maybe it was just a bird, Emily said, her voice trembling. I nodded, but I wasn't convinced. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. We finished packing up the car and got the hell out of there. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. We stopped for gas in a small town just outside the park. I went inside to pay, and as I was walking back to the car, I saw a group of teenagers hanging out by the gas pumps. They were all wearing t-shirts with that same symbol on them, the circle with the line through it. I froze, my blood running cold. These kids were part of it. They knew what was going on. I hurried back to the car and told Emily what I'd seen. She was just as freaked out as I was. We need to get out of here, she said. Now. We got back on the road and didn't stop driving until we were miles away from Yosemite. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That those kids, or whoever they were working for, were still out there, somewhere. We never went back to Yosemite. And to this day, I still don't know what we saw in those woods. But I know one thing, we were lucky to get out alive. Even though we were hundreds of miles away from Yosemite, the fear lingered. It clung to me like a shadow, whispering doubts and anxieties in my ear. Sleep became a battlefield, haunted by nightmares of that symbol and the feeling of being watched. Every night, the same dream would play out. I'd be running through the dark woods, branches whipping in my face, the sound of heavy breathing close behind me. I'd glance over my shoulder and see nothing. Just a void, a darkness that seemed to suck the light from the world. But I could feel its presence, a malevolent entity stalking me, closing in. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the sheets twisted around me. Emily would be beside me, sound asleep, oblivious to my terror. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside my window, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream. But it wasn't just a dream. It was a premonition, a warning. I knew, deep down, that whatever we had encountered in Yosemite wasn't finished with us. It was waiting, biding its time, until it could strike again. The days were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't enjoy the things I used to. Every time I saw a group of teenagers, I'd scrutinize them, looking for that symbol, that mark of the cult. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't help myself. Emily was struggling too. She was withdrawn and quiet, her usual bubbly personality replaced by a haunted look in her eyes. We tried to talk about it, to make sense of what had happened, but the words always caught in our throats. It was as if the experience had created a rift between us, a chasm of fear and uncertainty that we couldn't bridge. One night, I woke up to find Emily sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "He's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can feel him." I sat up beside her, my heart pounding. "Who's here?" "The man from the woods," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's watching us." I looked around the room, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows cast by the streetlights outside our window. "There's no one here, Em," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's just a dream." But even as I said it, I felt a chill run down my spine. I could feel it too, a presence in the room, a malevolent entity watching us from the darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. The constant fear, the nightmares, the feeling of being watched, it was driving me crazy. I had to do something, anything, to break free from this nightmare. "We're leaving," I announced to Emily one morning. "We're getting out of here." She looked at me, her eyes filled with relief. "Where are we going?" "It doesn't matter," I said. "Anywhere. Just as long as it's far away from here." We packed our bags, threw them in the car, and hit the road. We drove for hours, not stopping until we were in another state. We checked into a motel, a cheap, rundown place, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that we were away from the house, away from the woods, away from the symbol. But the relief was short-lived. The nightmares continued, even more vivid now, more terrifying. And the feeling of being watched, it was still there, lurking in the shadows, following us wherever we went. One night, I woke up to the sound of scratching at the window. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like something was trying to get in. I crept to the window and peered out. There, in the dim light of the street lamp, I saw a figure standing by the car. It was tall and thin, its limbs elongated and distorted, its head a grotesque, misshapen blob. I gasped and stumbled back from the window. The figure turned its head and looked up at me. Its eyes were black, empty sockets, staring into my soul. I screamed and ran to the door, fumbling with the lock. The scratching at the window grew louder, more frantic. I could hear the creature moving around outside, trying to find a way in. I finally got the door open and ran out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. I could hear the creature pounding on the door, its rage echoing through the motel. I ran down the hallway, screaming for help, but there was no one there. The motel was deserted, empty. I reached the end of the hallway and found myself trapped. There was nowhere to go, The creature burst through the door, its eyes burning with hatred. It lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I closed my eyes and waited for the end. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the impact, but it never came. Instead, I heard a shriek, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the empty hallway. I opened my eyes to see Emily standing in front of me, a fire extinguisher clutched in her hand. She had smashed it against the creature's head, the force of the blow sending it reeling backwards. The creature stumbled, its grotesque face contorted in pain. It let out a guttural roar, its eyes burning with rage. It lunged at Emily, its claws outstretched. But Emily was ready for it. She swung the fire extinguisher again, this time catching the creature in the chest. The creature staggered backwards, its breath rattling in its throat. I knew we had to get out of there. I grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her towards the stairs. We ran down the steps, the creature's roars echoing behind us. We burst out of the motel and into the night. We ran across the parking lot, not stopping until we reached the main road. We flagged down a passing car and begged the driver to take us to the nearest police station. The driver, a kind-faced woman, agreed without hesitation. At the police station, we told our story to a skeptical officer. He listened patiently, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He probably thought we were crazy or high on something. But then Emily showed him the photos she had taken of the symbol in Yosemite. The officer's expression changed. He recognized the symbol. "This is bad," he said, his voice grave. "Very bad." He told us that the symbol was associated with a group of people who lived in the mountains. They were known for their strange rituals and their violent tendencies. "You were lucky to get away from them," he said. "They don't like outsiders." We spent the rest of the night at the police station, trying to process what had happened. We were safe now, but the fear lingered. We knew that the creature and the people it served were still out there. And we knew that they wouldn't rest until they found us. The police offered to put us in protective custody, but we refused. We couldn't bear the thought of being confined, watched, controlled. We just wanted to go home, to try and rebuild our lives, to forget the horrors we had witnessed. But the nightmares continued. Every night, I would wake up in a cold sweat. The image of the creature burned into my mind. I could still hear its guttural roars, its ragged breathing. I could still feel its presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike. Emily was falling apart. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. The trauma of what we had experienced had shattered her. She was a shell of her former self, haunted by fear and guilt. One day, she disappeared. I came home from work to find a note on the kitchen table. It was a short, simple message, scrawled in Emily's shaky handwriting. "I can't take it anymore. I'm sorry." I searched for her everywhere, but she was gone. I called the police, but they couldn't find any trace of her. She had vanished without a trace. I knew then that the creature had taken her. It had come for her in the night, just as it had come for us in the motel. And I knew that I would never see her again. I'm still haunted by what happened. I can't escape the memories, the fear, the guilt. I know that I will never be the same. I am writing this story as a warning. If you ever see that symbol, the circle with a line through it, turn back. Don't go any further. Don't let curiosity get the better of you. Because if you do, you might end up like me. Alone, haunted, and forever scarred by the horrors of Yosemite.